fall asleep to hilarious history. 1969, Celestial Folly and Earthly Absurdity by Mark Twain. Chapter 1, The Giant Leap into a Dusty Sandbox. Man has always had a peculiar, unrequited love affair with the moon. For the better part of several thousand years, we were content to sit on our porches, sipping something fermented and composing bad poetry to that silvery orb. We blamed it for our fits of madness, we used it to schedule our harvests, and we allowed it to guide our ships, provided the clouds didn't have other plans. It was a distant, respectable deity, an untouchable lantern hanging in the cosmic hallway. But by the year of our Lord 1969, humanity had grown restless. We had conquered the oceans, mapped the jungles, and invented the sliced bread loaf. Naturally, the next logical step was to build a giant exploding metal pencil and fire ourselves at the sky to see if the moon was actually made of green cheese or merely of very high-quality granite. Now you must understand the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the enterprise. To the casual observer, sending 3 men into a vacuum in a tin can seems less like progress and more like a very expensive form of assisted suicide. But we are a species driven by a singular, divine spark of idiocy. We simply cannot see a high fence without wondering what is on the other side, even if the other side is a lifeless, airless, God-forsaken desert where your blood would boil in your veins faster than a politician changes his mind after an election. The whole business was spurred on by a space race, which is a polite way of saying that the Americans and the Russians were engaged in a multi-billion-dollar game of my firework is bigger than yours. The Russians had already sent a dog into orbit, a charming fellow named Laika, who I suspect would have much preferred a bone and a fire hydrant in Moscow to the cold embrace of the cosmos. Having been beaten to the punch by a canine, the American government decided that the only way to regain their dignity was to put a human foot on the lunar surface and, more importantly, to do it before the other fellows could find a way to plant a hammer and sickle in the dust. Enter the Saturn V rocket. This was not a vehicle in any sense that a sane person would recognize. It was a 360-foot tower of kerosene, liquid oxygen, and pure concentrated anxiety. It had the horsepower of 160 million horses, which I can tell you from experience is a great deal more horses than any one man should ever have to manage, even in a dream. The plan was to set this skyscraper on fire at the bottom and hope that the resulting explosion pushed the top part toward the moon, rather than simply vaporizing the state of Florida. Sitting atop this controlled cataclysm were 3 brave souls. Neil Armstrong, a man so calm he likely had a resting pulse of comatose. Buzz Aldrin, who possessed a Ph.D. and a jawline that could crack walnuts. And Michael Collins, the most overlooked man in history. Collins's job was to drive the command module around the moon, while the other 2 went down to play in the dirt. He was to be the loneliest man in the universe, circling the dark side of the moon with no one to talk to, no television to watch, and the very real possibility that if his friends didn't come back, he'd have to fly home alone and explain to their wives why he'd left them on a rock 200,000 miles away. It is a testament to the man's character that he didn't simply lose his mind and start talking to his own reflection in the window. The journey took 3 days, 3 days of floating in a cabin the size of a large walk-in closet, eating food that had been squeezed into tubes like toothpaste, and dealing with the fact that in zero gravity there is no such thing as down, which makes the use of a bathroom an adventure I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. They traveled through a void so vast and empty it would make a philosopher weep, all while being guided by a computer that had less brains than a modern-day pocket watch. If you had told a man in 1869 that we would navigate the heavens using a box of clicking wires and vacuum tubes, he would have had you committed to the nearest asylum. In 1969, we called it state of the art. Then came the landing. The lunar module, aptly named the Eagle, detached from the main ship. It was a spindly, fragile-looking thing covered in gold foil, appearing for all the world like a giant mechanical spider that had been constructed by a very industrious but slightly drunk goldsmith. As they descended toward the surface, Armstrong realized the automatic system was steering them directly into a crater filled with boulders the size of houses. Now, a normal man would have panicked. A normal man would have screamed and tried to find the reverse gear. But Armstrong simply took the controls, hovered over the surface like a hawk looking for a field mouse, and landed with only 30 seconds of fuel remaining. Had he been 31 seconds late, the Eagle would have become a permanent, very expensive lawn ornament. He stepped out onto the ladder. Below him lay the magnificent desolation, as Aldrin later called it. Millions of people back on Earth were huddled around their television sets, watching a grainy, flickering black and white image that looked like it had been filmed through a bowl of gray soup. And then he did it. He planted his boot in the fine, powdery silt and uttered those immortal words. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. It was a grand sentiment. A bit rehearsed, perhaps, but grand. I personally would have preferred something more honest, along the lines of, "Good Lord, it's dusty up here," or, "I hope someone remembered to leave the porch light on in Houston." But history demands a certain level of gravitas, and Armstrong delivered. They spent 2.5 hours walking around. They collected rocks, 47 pounds of them. We spent $24 billion to go to the moon, and we came back with a bag of gravel. You can find gravel in any driveway in Missouri for free. But apparently, the gravel on the moon is special because it hasn't been stepped on by a cow or rained on since the beginning of time. They also set up a television camera, a solar wind experiment, and a flag. The flag, of course, was held up by a horizontal wire because, as any schoolboy knows, there is no wind on the moon. Without that wire, the stars and stripes would have hung limp and dejected, which simply wouldn't do for the evening news. They also left a plaque that said they came in peace for all mankind. This is the standard lie we tell whenever we show up somewhere uninvited. We said the same thing to the Indians, though we usually followed it up by taking their land and giving them blankets with holes in them. Fortunately, there were no moon men to displace, unless they were hiding in the craters and laughing at the sight of two grown men hopping around like overexcited kangaroos in pressurized suits. Because of the low gravity, the astronauts didn't walk. They bounced. They gambled. They performed a sort of cosmic ballet that looked remarkably like a man trying to walk through a vat of molasses while wearing lead boots. It was the most expensive gymnastics display in human history. When it was time to leave, they had to fire a small engine to get back up to Michael Collins, who was likely still circling the moon and wondering if he'd left the stove on back in Texas. There was a moment of tension when they discovered a circuit breaker had snapped off, the one that would actually start the engine. They fixed it with a felt-tip pen. Yes, the pinnacle of American engineering was saved by a piece of stationery. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the resilience of the human spirit and the sheer luck that governs our species, nothing will. They splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, where they were promptly greeted not with a parade, but with a giant container. We were terrified they might have brought back moon germs, tiny celestial pathogens that would turn our brains to custard. We put the greatest heroes of the age into a sealed box for 3 weeks, where they peered out of a window like prize hamsters at a county fair. In the end, what did we learn? We learned that the moon is gray, quiet, and incredibly lonely. We learned that man can go anywhere he pleases, provided he has enough taxpayer money and a sufficient lack of common sense. And we learned that no matter how far we travel, we always bring our own shadows with us. The 1969 moon landing was a glorious, ridiculous, impossible triumph. It proved that we are a race of dreamers who aren't afraid to set fire to ourselves in the name of curiosity. It was a giant leap indeed. But as I looked up at that moon the following night, I couldn't help but notice it looked exactly the same as it always had. The only difference was that now, somewhere up there in the silence, there was a bag of discarded cameras, a golf ball or two, and a very expensive flag that nobody was around to salute. History is like that. We spend our lives trying to reach the heavens, only to find that once we get there, we're still just the same old fools, only with a better view of the house we left behind. TwAIn's final thought for the chapter. The moon is a silent witness to all our follies. It has seen the rise and fall of empires, the invention of the steam engine, and the birth of the cocktail. It was probably quite relieved when we finally left. After all, there goes the neighborhood. Chapter 2. Mr. Nixon Moves In. There is a peculiar disease that strikes certain men, usually those who have spent too much time in darkened rooms or legal offices, which convinces them that the only thing standing between the world and total dissolution is their own presence in a specific white-painted house in the District of Columbia. In January of 1969, a gentleman by the name of Richard Milhouse Nixon finally succumbed to this affliction after a decade of trying to catch it. He had spent years in the political wilderness, wandering through the tall grass of California and the concrete canyons of New York, wearing a look of such concentrated grievance that one might have thought the entire universe had conspired to steal his favorite pen. But on the 20th of January, he stood on the Capitol steps, hand on a Bible, and assumed the presidency. It was a chilly day, appropriate for a man whose natural internal temperature hovered somewhere around that of a well-chilled cucumber. As he took the oath, he wore that famous expression, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, which were too busy darting around to see if anyone was planning to take it back. I have seen many smiles in my time. I have seen the smile of a riverboat gambler who has just drawn an inside straight, and the smile of a cat who has successfully relocated a canary. But the Nixon smile was a unique biological phenomenon. It looked as though his face was a hostage situation and his teeth were the negotiators. Now, you must understand the man who was leaving to appreciate the man who was arriving. Lyndon Baines Johnson was a Texas hurricane in a three-piece suit. He was a man who would grab you by the lapels, stick his nose 3 inches from yours, and tell you exactly how the world was going to work until you agreed with him just so you could breathe again. When LBJ left, the air in Washington suddenly felt much thinner. Into this vacuum stepped Richard Nixon, a man who preferred to communicate via memo, who treated social interaction like a complex naval maneuver, and who viewed the American public as a large, unpredictable animal that needed to be distracted with shiny objects and law and order. He brought with him a concept known as the New Nixon. In the history of advertising, there has never been a more optimistic campaign. The idea was that the old Nixon, the one who had lost to Kennedy in 1960 and then told the press they wouldn't have him to kick around anymore in 1962, had been taken apart, greased, and reassembled with better parts. This new Nixon was supposedly statesmanlike, serene, and above the fray. It was a magnificent piece of fiction. It was like taking a snapping turtle, painting it pink, and trying to convince the neighbors it was a flamingo. Underneath the new coat of paint, it was still the same turtle, and it was still looking for a finger to bite. The primary problem facing the new tenant was, of course, the Vietnam War. It was a messy, loud, and thoroughly unpleasant affair that had been handed down to him like a family heirloom that also happened to be a ticking bomb. Nixon's solution was a phrase that deserves a place in the Hall of Fame for linguistic gymnastics: peace with honor. Whenever a politician uses the word honor, it is a wise precaution to reach for your wallet and check your pockets. Peace with honor essentially meant that we were going to stop fighting as soon as we could find a way to make it look like we hadn't actually stopped. It was like a man who, having jumped out of a 10-story window, tries to convince the onlookers on the 5th floor that he is merely taking a shortcut to the sidewalk and that his descent is entirely voluntary and dignified. Nixon's plan was Vietnamization, a word so ugly it could only have been birthed in a windowless office, which meant training the locals to do the dying while we slowly backed toward the exit, whistling a jaunty tune and pretending we weren't in a hurry. But Nixon's true genius lay in his discovery of the silent majority. This was a masterstroke of political sorcery. He looked out at a country filled with protesting students, shouting activists, and people burning their undergarments in the streets, and he declared that there was a vast, invisible army of people who agreed with him but simply weren't saying anything. It is the perfect constituency. A politician who claims to speak for the silent is never in danger of being contradicted by his supporters. They are silent, after all. It is like being the captain of a ship crewed entirely by ghosts. They never complain about the food, they don't mind the weather, and they always approve of the course you're steering, provided you have a vivid enough imagination. To manage this silent empire, Nixon surrounded himself with a group of men who made the Spanish Inquisition look like a welcoming committee. Chief among them were H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, known to the terrified inhabitants of the White House as the Berlin Wall. Haldeman was a man who wore a crew cut so sharp you could use it to plane a door, and he possessed a personality that was entirely composed of right angles. Together, they acted as the president's gatekeepers, ensuring that no one reached the great man unless they had been thoroughly scrubbed of any dissenting opinions or inconvenient truths. They were a grim bunch. I have always believed that a man who cannot laugh at himself should not be trusted with anything more dangerous than a butter knife, and yet Here were the leaders of the free world huddled in the Oval Office, treating the daily news cycle like a grand conspiracy against their personal dignity. They spent their time making lists. Nixon loved a list. He had an enemies list that grew longer than a Sunday sermon. If you were a journalist who asked a pointed question, a celebrity who favored the wrong charity, or a politician who had a better tailor, you went on the list. There is something deeply touching about a man with the power to command nuclear submarines spending his evenings checking off the names of actors he doesn't like. It is the ultimate proof that the presidency does not change a man. It merely provides him with a much larger magnifying glass for his own insecurities. And then there were the public appearances. Nixon was a man who desperately wanted to be liked, but he had the social grace of a man trying to play a violin while wearing oven mitts. He famously walked on the beach in California wearing black wingtip shoes, a sight that surely made the seagulls weep with confusion. He would go on television and talk about his dog, Checkers, or his wife's respectable Republican cloth coat, trying to prove he was just a regular fellow. But the harder he tried to be regular, the more he appeared to be a man who had only recently learned about the concept of people from a poorly translated manual. Yet for all his awkwardness and his fortress of solitude, the man was a survivor. He had a tenacity that you have to admire, in the same way you admire a weed that grows through a crack in a tombstone. He had clawed his way back from the scrap heap of history to sit in the big chair, and he was determined to stay there come hell or high water. And as it turned out, both were on their way. As 1969 rolled on, the Nixon administration settled into a rhythm of secret bombings, public proclamations of serenity, and a growing obsession with leaks. To a man like Nixon, a leak in the government was not just a bureaucratic nuisance. It was a personal betrayal, a hole in the hull of his ship that threatened to let in the cold, dark water of reality. He would eventually form a group called the Plumbers to fix these leaks, an irony that is almost too delicious for a humble writer like myself to contemplate. If you hire a group of burglars to be your plumbers, you shouldn't be surprised when the whole house ends up underwater. But in the early months of '69, the disaster was still a few years off. For now, there was just the man, the office, and the silent majority watching from the shadows. Nixon was in his element, a dark room, a yellow legal pad, and the intoxicating feeling that he was finally the one in charge. He had moved in, the curtains were changed, the enemies list was taped to the inside of the desk drawer, and the long, strange journey of the Nixon era had begun. It was going to be a bumpy ride, but at least the pilot was wearing his best suit and a smile that looked like it had been applied with a staple gun. TwAIn's note for the weary. If you find yourself unable to sleep after contemplating the machinery of government, do not fret. The beauty of a republic is that even if the pilot is a bit eccentric, the ship is so large and the bureaucratic barnacles so thick that it takes a great deal of effort to actually hit the rocks. Of course, Mr. Nixon was never one to shy away from effort. Chapter 3. The Beatles on the Roof. In the frozen, damp January of 1969, the city of London was witness to a phenomenon that proved once and for all that when a committee of 4 geniuses cannot agree on what to have for lunch, the only logical solution is to climb onto a roof and start a riot. I am speaking, of course, of the Beatles, those four Liverpudlian lads who had spent the better part of a decade convincing the world's youth that hair was more important than soap, and that a catchy melody was a valid substitute for a foreign policy. By 1969, the Fab Four had become something of a misnomer. They were still four, but they were about as fab as a toothache. They had reached that peculiar stage of fame where they had too much money to be hungry, too much talent to be ignored, and too much ego to be in the same room for more than 20 minutes without someone threatening to quit, join a monastery, or sue the others for emotional damages. They were, in essence, a crumbling empire held together by a shared history of screaming girls and a very large pile of royalties. They decided, in a fit of inexplicable optimism, to film themselves making an album from scratch. It was to be a return to their roots, which is a phrase celebrities use when they've forgotten how to be human and want to pretend they still enjoy the smell of a damp rehearsal space. They called the project Get Back, which was ironic, considering most of them were actually trying to get away. The rehearsals took place at Twickenham Film Studios, a place that possessed the warmth and charm of a refrigerated airplane hangar. There, they sat under glaring lights, surrounded by cameras and a growing sense of mutual loathing. Paul McCartney acted like a schoolmaster trying to teach calculus to a room full of bored kittens. George Harrison sat in a corner looking as though he had discovered a very sour lemon in his tea. Ringo Starr looked on with the patient, glassy-eyed endurance of a man who has seen everything and decided that drumming is the only thing that makes sense. And John Lennon was mostly occupied with being an avant-garde extension of Yoko Ono. Yoko's presence at these sessions has been the subject of much historical debate. But from my vantage point, it was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. She sat on a stool, inches from the amplifiers, knitting or reading the paper, serving as a silent, unblinking reminder that the Brotherhood of the Beatles now had a permanent auditor. It is a fundamental law of nature that you cannot have a secret clubhouse if someone's wife is sitting in the corner watching you eat your crackers. Eventually, the tension grew so thick you could have carved it into statues. George Harrison actually did quit for a few days, likely to go find a place where people didn't argue about bass lines, but he was lured back with the promise of a new keyboard player and the possibility that they might actually finish the blasted project. The climax of this absurdity occurred on January 30th. They needed a big finish for their film. They had discussed performing at an ancient amphitheater in Tunisia or on a cruise ship, or perhaps in an asylum, all grand ideas that required a level of logistical coordination the group no longer possessed. In the end, they did what any group of exhausted Englishmen would do. They took the shortest possible walk. They went up the stairs. They emerged onto the roof of their business headquarters at 3 Savile Row. Savile Row, for those who haven't had the pleasure, is the holy of holies for British tailoring. It is a street where men in bowler hats discuss the precise width of a lapel with the solemnity of a high priest. It is not a place where one expects to hear electric guitars cranked to a volume that could rattle the fillings out of a banker's teeth. The wardrobe for the occasion was a triumph of 1969 fashion, which is to say, it looked as though they had all lost a bet with a thrift shop. John Lennon wore Yoko's brown fur coat, looking like a very talented grizzly bear. Ringo borrowed his wife's bright red plastic raincoat, which made him look like a cheerful fire hydrant. Paul was in a sensible suit, looking like the only person who had remembered he had a job, and George wore lime green trousers that were a crime against the optical nerves of anyone within a 3-block radius. And then they played. For 42 minutes, the Beatles were a band again. The cold wind whipped across the rooftops, numbing their fingers, but the music was tight, raw, and surprisingly joyous. They played Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, and I've Got a Feeling to an audience consisting of seagulls, chimney pots, and a rapidly gathering crowd of confused Londoners on the street below. It was a beautiful, chaotic spectacle. On the pavement, the reaction was a perfect microcosm of humanity. There were the youngsters, looking up with grins that threatened to split their faces, delighted that the heavens were finally raining down something better than soot. And then there were the respectable citizens, men with umbrellas and stiff collars who looked as though the very fabric of civilization was being unraveled by a blues riff. They complained about the noise. They complained about the obstruction of traffic. They complained that they couldn't hear themselves think, which, given the quality of their thoughts, was likely a blessing. Eventually, the Metropolitan Police arrived. Now, the British Bobby is a peculiar creature. He is trained to handle a riot with the same polite firmness he uses to give directions to a lost tourist. 2 young officers entered the building, looking slightly embarrassed to be arresting the most famous people on the planet for the crime of being too loud on a Thursday. They made their way to the roof, and for a few glorious minutes the police stood there, unsure whether to pull the plug or ask for an autograph. The Beatles, seeing the uniforms, played even harder. There is nothing that improves a rock and roll performance quite like the threat of imminent incarceration. It adds a certain zing to the vocals. Finally, the power was cut. The guitars fell silent, and the great experiment was over. John Lennon stepped to the microphone, adjusted his glasses, and said, "I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we passed the audition." It was a quintessential bit of Liverpudlian wit, a dry acknowledgment that after a decade of conquering the world, they were still just 4 guys trying to get a gig. It was the last time they would ever play together in public. They didn't know it then, or perhaps they did, but they were closing the book on an era. They went back downstairs, drank some tea, and eventually went their separate ways. The Get Back sessions would eventually become the album Let It Be, a title that served as a piece of advice they were all too happy to follow. They let it be. They let the band die so that the legend could live on, which is a very sensible business move, even if it breaks the hearts of millions. Looking back from the safety of my cloud, I find the rooftop concert to be the most TwAIn-esque moment of the entire decade. It was a grand public thumbing of the nose at the establishment from a height of 5 stories. It proved that you can be the most powerful person in your field, but you are still subject to the whims of a man in a blue hat with a noise complaint. It was funny, it was loud, it was unnecessary, and it was brilliant. The Beatles proved that day that if you're going to go out, you should go out where everyone can see you, even if you're wearing your wife's raincoat and your fingers are frozen solid. It was the last gasp of a decade that had tried to change the world with a song, only to find that the world would rather just have a bit of peace and quiet, so it could get back to its tailoring. TwAIn's note for the night. Music is a wonderful thing, but it is best enjoyed when someone is trying to stop you from playing it. If you ever find yourself on a roof with a guitar, play loud enough to wake the neighbors. If you don't, you're just a man on a roof, and that's merely a roofer with a hobby. Chapter 4. The Boeing 747 Takes Flight. If there is one thing I have learned from my time both above and below the sod, it is that the human race is possessed by a frantic, almost pathological desire to be somewhere else. We are never quite satisfied with the patch of dirt we currently occupy. In my day, we were content to spend 3 weeks on a steamship, vibrating in time with the engines and contemplating the vast, watery loneliness of the Atlantic, while eating salt beef that had the structural integrity of a boot heel. It was a slow, dignified way to realize you shouldn't have left home in the first place. But by February of 1969, the species had decided that 3 weeks was 19 days and 23 hours too long. We had already mastered the art of the jet set, but the planes were too small, the seats were too narrow, and there simply weren't enough people being catapulted through the stratosphere at any given moment. The solution, birthed from the fevered dreams of a man named Juan Trippe of TwAIn and a group of engineers at Boeing known as the Incredibles, was the Boeing 747. They called it the Jumbo Jet, a name that suggests a certain circus-like whimsy, which is appropriate when you consider that the thing was essentially a flying warehouse designed to defy every law of God, man, and common sense. To understand the 747, you must first appreciate the scale of the audacity involved. In the mid-60s, Juan Trippe, a man who viewed the globe as a giant chessboard and himself as the only one allowed to move the pieces, told the Boeing company that he wanted a plane twice the size of the 707. He wanted a Leviathan. He wanted a ship of the line that could carry hundreds of people, their luggage, their anxieties, and perhaps a small orchestra, all at 600 miles per hour. Boeing, being a company that never met a suicidal challenge it didn't like, said, "Certainly," and then realized they didn't actually have a building large enough to build the thing. They had to go to Everett, Washington, clear out a forest, and construct the largest building in the world by volume. It was so vast that clouds used to form inside the ceiling and rain on the workers, a charming touch of nature for an aerospace factory. If you are building a machine so large that it requires its own internal weather system just to keep the roof from collapsing, you are either a genius or you are overdue for a psychiatric evaluation. The engineers, the Incredibles, designed this beast in 16 months. 16 months. In the modern age, it takes 16 months for a government subcommittee to decide on the color of a postage stamp. These men worked with slide rules, pieces of wood with markings on them that told you how likely you were to fall out of the sky. There were no supercomputers, no digital simulations, just math, coffee, and the terrifying knowledge that if they misplaced a decimal point, the resulting catastrophe would be visible from Mars. The design of the 747 is dominated by the hump. Now, most creatures with a hump are either camels or victims of a tragic spinal curvature. The 747 has a hump because the designers were convinced that the future of air travel belonged to supersonic jets like the Concorde. They thought the 747 would eventually be relegated to carrying freight, boxes of shoes, crates of pineapples, and the like. Therefore, they put the cockpit on the second floor so the nose could swing open like the maw of a hungry shark to swallow cargo. This, of course, left a small space behind the pilots. In the early days, instead of filling it with more shivering passengers, they turned it into a first-class lounge. It was a glorious era of absurdity. Imagine, if you will, being 5 miles above the earth, sipping a martini in a velvet swivel chair while a man in a tuxedo plays a piano. It was the height of civilization, or perhaps the pinnacle of decadence, depending on how much you'd had to drink. On February 9th, 1969, the first 747, christened the city of Everett, prepared for its maiden flight. A crowd of dignitaries, reporters, and people who had come to see a spectacular explosion gathered at the runway. The plane weighed over 700,000 pounds. To the average observer, the idea that such a mass of aluminum, wire, and upholstery could ever leave the ground is an insult to the intelligence. It is a fundamental truth that heavy things stay down. Stones, anchors, and political speeches all follow this rule. Yet, when the 4 Pratt and Whitney engines roared to life, sounds that I imagine resembled the collective groans of the damned, the 747 didn't just move, it lumbered. It picked up speed with the grace of a pregnant elephant running for a bus. And then, at the last possible second, it simply decided to fly. Gravity, I suspect, was so startled by the sheer gall of the machine that it forgot to pull it back down. The pilot, Jack Waddell, later described the plane as a pilot's dream, though I suspect any man sitting in a cockpit 2 stories in the air while traveling at takeoff speed is prone to a certain level of poetic exaggeration. When it touched back down, the world had changed. The era of the elite traveler was dead, though nobody had told the folks in first class yet. The 747 did for the sky what the Ford Model T did for the mud. It made it available to the masses. Suddenly, the school teacher from Peoria could afford to fly to London and complain about the T. The jumbo jet democratized the heavens. It allowed humanity to be miserable in much larger groups. Instead of 50 people being cramped and bored in a small tube, we could now have 400 people being cramped and bored in a giant tube. This is what we call progress. It also changed the very geography of our planet. Airports had to be rebuilt. Runways had to be lengthened. Terminals had to be expanded to accommodate the sudden deluge of humanity that poured out of these metal whales. The 747 was so large that it had its own zip code in the minds of the air traffic controllers. But there is an irony to it all. We built this magnificent, soaring achievement of engineering, a cathedral of the clouds, and within a few years we had stripped out the piano bars, replaced the velvet lounges with economy seats that would make a sardine feel claustrophobic, and began charging people for the privilege of eating a bag of 3 peanuts. We took a miracle and turned it into a bus with wings. Still, you have to admire the 747. It is a testament to the fact that if you apply enough thrust to a brick, you can make it fly. And if you make the brick large enough, you can convince the world it's a vacation. In 1969, the 747 stood as a symbol of American confidence, a belief that there was no problem too big to be solved by more engines and a larger building. As the city of Everett banked over the mountains of Washington on that February afternoon, it looked like the future. It was a future where the world was smaller, the noise was louder, and the view from 30,000 feet was available to anyone with a credit card and a desire to be elsewhere. I've always said that travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. If that is true, then the 747 was the greatest weapon against ignorance ever devised. Though, having seen the way people behave in airports lately, I suspect ignorance is putting up a much stiffer fight than we anticipated. TwAIn's bedtime admonition. Now close your eyes and imagine you're in that upper deck lounge in 1969. The engines are a distant hum, the martini is cold, and the seat is wide enough for a man to keep his dignity. It is a lovely dream. Just don't think about the fact that you're currently sitting on 70,000 gallons of flammable liquid. That sort of thinking is bad for the digestion. Chapter 5. A Muddy Miracle at Woodstock. If the moon landing was humanity's attempt to prove we could be cold, calculated, and mathematically precise, then Woodstock was the corrective measure. A 3-day demonstration that we are, at our core, a collection of chaotic, damp, and remarkably disorganized mammals. While Neil Armstrong was navigating the vacuum of space with the icy nerves of a professional assassin, 500,000 of his fellow citizens were navigating a cow pasture in Bethel, New York, with the coordination of a group of squirrels who had accidentally discovered a fermented apple orchard. It was billed as 3 days of peace and music, which is a lovely sentiment, provided you don't mind the peace being interrupted by a catastrophic shortage of sandwiches and the music being piped through a sound system that had to compete with the sound of several thousand people simultaneously discovering they had lost their shoes. The event was the brainchild of 4 young men who had a great deal of money and a staggering lack of experience in the field of crowd control. They originally wanted to hold the festival in Wallkill, New York, but the locals there, possessed of that rare and beautiful thing called common sense, decided they didn't want several thousand unwashed youths trampling their petunias. They chased the organizers out of town with the kind of bureaucratic vigor usually reserved for tax collectors. And so the circus moved to Max Yasgur's farm. Max was a dairy farmer, a man who understood cows, alfalfa, and the predictable rhythms of nature. He did not, I suspect, understand that he was about to invite the entire age of Aquarius to use his front yard as a collective bathtub. He leased his land for $75,000, which likely seemed like a king's ransom at the time, but in hindsight, it wouldn't have covered the cost of the aspirin required to deal with the aftermath. By Friday, August 15th, it became clear that the organizers had underestimated the turnout by approximately 400,000 people. They had expected maybe 50,000. When 10 times that number showed up, the infrastructure did what any sensible thing does under pressure. It collapsed. The New York State Thruway became the world's longest, most colorful parking lot. People simply abandoned their cars in the middle of the highway, grabbed their guitars, and started walking. It was a migration of the soul, or perhaps just a migration of people who didn't understand how a dual carriageway works. For miles in every direction, the landscape was littered with Volkswagens and people wearing enough fringe to clothe a Victorian drawing room. The fences, such as they were, didn't last 5 minutes. The organizers, faced with a choice between a riot and a charitable donation, declared the festival free. This is a magnificent way to run a business if your goal is to lose your shirt, your shoes, and your sanity all in one weekend. Suddenly the gate was gone, and the masses poured in, a tidal wave of tie-dye, patchouli, and good vibes that had no place to sleep and even fewer places to dispose of their biological necessities. Now, I have traveled the Mississippi in the height of mosquito season, and I have seen the mud of the Missouri River after a spring thaw. But the mud at Woodstock was a character unto itself. It didn't just sit on the ground, it sought you out. It was a sentient, clinging ooze that turned the festival into a sort of slop-o-rama. By the second day, when the heavens opened and rained down with a ferocity usually reserved for Noah, the crowd didn't run for cover. They couldn't. There was no cover. Instead, they slid. They slid down the hillsides. They wrestled in the muck. And they convinced themselves that being covered in 3 inches of wet topsoil was a form of spiritual enlightenment. As for the music, well, it was there, somewhere behind the wall of rain and the haze of herbal supplements. Richie Havens started things off because he was the only one who could get to the stage, and he played for nearly 3 hours because the other bands were still stuck in traffic. He eventually ran out of songs and started improvising, which is the polite way of saying he was shouting "freedom" until his vocal cords resembled frayed rope. The Who performed at 4 a.m, which is the time of day when God intended for all men to be in bed, dreaming of anything but electric guitars. Pete Townshend, a man who treats his instrument with the same affection a woodcutter treats a stubborn log, spent his set looking like he wanted to murder the entire front row. Janis Joplin wailed into the night with a voice that sounded like it had been seasoned in a vat of whiskey and broken glass. It was beautiful in a terrifying sort of way. Jimi Hendrix closed the show on Monday morning. By then, the crowd of 500,000 had dwindled to about 30,000, mostly the people who were too tired to move or too confused to find their cars. He played the Star-Spangled Banner using feedback and distortion to mimic the sound of falling bombs and screaming sirens. It was a performance that would have made the Founding Fathers reach for their muskets. But in 1969, it was considered a masterpiece of social commentary. But the real story wasn't on the stage. It was in the hog farm. A gentleman who went by the name of Wavy Gravy, a name that suggests a certain fluidity of character, was in charge of security. His security consisted of the police force, whose primary weapon was asking people nicely not to do things they were already doing. He also managed the kitchen, serving breakfast in bed for 400,000, which mostly consisted of granola and a relentless sense of optimism. There were also the announcements from the stage, the famous warnings about the brown acid. I have always found it amusing that in the midst of a cultural revolution, the most pressing concern was the quality control of illicit substances. "The brown acid is not specifically too good," the announcer said, with the solemnity of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. It was a helpful tip for the discerning youth of 1969 who wanted to lose their minds, but preferred to do so with a higher-grade product. Despite the mud, the hunger, the rain, and the fact that the local townspeople were watching from their porches with a mixture of horror and fascination, something miraculous happened. Nothing went wrong, or rather, everything went wrong, but nobody cared. There were no fights, there were no riots, there were just 500,000 people being remarkably polite to one another while they shared their last crust of bread and their only dry blanket. It was a 3-day suspension, of the laws of human nature. If you put 500,000 bankers in a muddy field with no food and only one portable toilet per 10,000 people, you would have a massacre by sunset. But the hippies, bless their fuzzy hearts, just kept singing. When the music finally stopped and the mud began to dry, the crowd drifted away, leaving behind a field that looked like a battleground from the Civil War, only with more discarded fringe and fewer horses. Max Yasgur looked at his ruined farm and reportedly said, "I think we proved something to the world." I suspect he proved that if you give people enough music and enough rain, they will forget that they are supposed to be miserable. Or perhaps he proved that the human spirit is a resilient thing, capable of finding peace and love, even when it's knee-deep in a cow pasture and hasn't had a proper meal in 48 hours. Woodstock became a legend, a myth, a nation. Those who were there claimed it changed their lives. Those who weren't there spent the next 40 years lying and saying they were. It stands as the ultimate monument to the 1960s, a decade that tried to save the world with a melody and ended up just getting very, very dirty. TwAIn's bedtime observation: if you ever find yourself invited to a happening in a field, bring your own sandwich and a sturdy pair of boots. You can't eat vibes, and you certainly can't walk home on them when the car won't start. Now, go to sleep before I tell you about the prices they're charging for Woodstock t-shirts in the future. That's a real nightmare. Chapter 6. The Birth of the ARPANET. In my day, if you wanted to send a message to a gentleman in San Francisco while you were currently enduring the humidity of New Orleans, you had a few choices, none of which were particularly brisk. You could trust your sentiments to a steamship, which might eventually arrive if it didn't encounter a snag or a boiler explosion. You could employ the Pony Express, a system where a very small man on a very fast horse risked his life to deliver your grocery list for the princely sum of $5 per half ounce, a rate that makes modern postage look like a charitable donation. Or, if you were feeling particularly modern, you could use the telegraph, a series of clicks and clacks that reduced the majesty of the English language to a series of frantic stutters. But in October of 1969, a group of scientists, men with high foreheads, thick glasses, and a profound lack of sunlight, decided that these methods were far too dignified. They set out to create a way for computers to talk to one another, presumably so the machines could complain about their operators without being overheard. They called it the ARPANET, a name that sounds like a brand of industrial-strength hairnet, but which was actually the precursor to the thing you now call the Internet. Now, you must understand the state of the computer in 1969. It was not a sleek slab of glass you carry in your pocket to record your lunch. A computer in 1969 was a hulking, shuddering leviathan the size of several large refrigerators, housed in a room with air conditioning so powerful it could preserve a side of beef for a century. These machines had less memory than a modern-day singing greeting card, yet they required a team of priests, known as programmers, to feed them punched cards and pray for a lack of static electricity. The project was funded by ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, an arm of the Department of Defense. The military, in its infinite wisdom, wanted a communication system that could survive a nuclear holocaust. The idea was that if the Russians decided to turn the Pentagon into a very large smoking hole in the ground, the rest of the country could still coordinate its response, or at least continue to send memos. They wanted a decentralized network, a web of wires where if one part was blown to smithereens, the rest would simply find a new way around, like a colony of ants, after a particularly vigorous foot stamping. On the night of October 29, 1969, a young graduate student at UCLA named Charlie Klein prepared to send the very first message across this new digital frontier. He was sitting at an SDS Sigma 7 computer, which I am told was a very impressive pile of metal at the time. His goal was to send the word Logan to another computer at the Stanford Research Institute, several hundred miles to the north. Imagine the tension. The history of humanity was about to pivot. We had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of the written word, from stone tablets to the printing press, and now we were about to enter the era of instantaneous thought transfer. Charlie typed the letter L. He called his counterpart at Stanford on a regular telephone because, ironically, you needed a telephone to make sure the computer was working, and asked, "Did you get the L?" "Got the L," came the reply. Charlie typed the O. "Did you get the O?" "Got the O," said Stanford. Then Charlie typed the G. At that precise moment, the system, a multi-million-dollar achievement of American engineering, suffered a catastrophic nervous breakdown. The computer at Stanford crashed. The connection vanished into the ether. The grand inaugural message of the digital age, intended to be a functional utilitarian login, was instead reduced to a simple, mournful "Lo." There is something profoundly poetic about that. Lo, as in lo and behold, or perhaps lo, how the mighty have fallen. It is the most TwAIn-esque beginning imaginable. We spent a fortune and decades of research to invent a new way to speak, and our first word was a stuttering fragment. It was as if the universe were saying, "Slow down, children. You aren't ready for the G yet." Of course, they fixed the G an hour later, and by the end of the year, there were 4 nodes on the network: UCLA, Stanford, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. It was a small private club of geniuses who used the system to share research papers and discuss the intricacies of packet switching. They believed they were building a digital library of Alexandria, a hallowed hall of human knowledge where the greatest minds could collaborate for the benefit of all mankind. Oh, those poor, deluded souls. If you had told those men in 1969 that their nuclear survivable research tool would eventually be used to share pictures of grumpy cats, to allow people to argue with strangers about the shape of the earth, and to provide a platform for every village idiot to have a global megaphone, they would have pulled the plug right then and there and gone back to using the Pony Express. The ARPANET was the birth of the comment section. It was the beginning of the end of privacy, the end of quiet reflection, and the start of a world where everyone is constantly connected, yet somehow more lonely than a lighthouse keeper in a fog bank. In my day, if you had an opinion, you had to write it down, find a stamp, and wait a week for someone to tell you that you were wrong. This gave you 7 days to realize you were being an ass and perhaps change your mind. Today, the internet allows you to be an ass at the speed of light, with no time for second thoughts or basic grammar. But in 1969, the low was just a technical glitch, not a warning. The scientists were delighted. They had proven that bits of data could be broken into little pieces, tossed into the wind, and reassembled on the other side. It was a miracle of logic. They didn't realize they had just opened Pandora's box and found that it was filled with pop-up ads and terms of service agreements that no human being would ever read. As the years rolled on, the 4 nodes became 40, then 400, then 4 billion. The wires became fiber optics. The refrigerators became pockets, and the low became a roar that never stops. We have created a world where we can talk to anyone, anywhere, at any time, and yet we have remarkably little to say to one another that isn't a complaint or a picture of our dinner. I find it particularly amusing that the ARPANET was designed to survive a war, yet it is currently being defeated by a lack of civility and a surplus of influencers. We built a fortress of data, and then we invited the trolls to live in the basement. But let us not be too hard on the year 1969. It was a year of first steps, after all. We took a small step on the moon, and we took a small low on the computer. Both were leaps into the unknown. One led to a bag of rocks, and the other led to, well, to whatever it is you're doing right now. I've always said that the human race has one really effective weapon, and that is laughter. If you can't laugh at the fact that the most powerful communication tool in history began with a crash and a 2-letter typo, then you have no business being on the internet in the first place. TwAIn's bedtime consideration. The next time you are frustrated that your Wi-Fi is slow, remember Charlie Klein and his lonely LO. He didn't have high-definition video. He barely had a G. Be grateful for your connection, but for heaven's sake, use it to say something worth hearing. If you can't be wise, at least be brief. Now, shut down your node and go to sleep. The data will still be there in the morning, and it won't be any more sensible then. Chapter 7. Sesame Street's Grand Opening. In the simpler, more honest days of my youth, if a child wished to acquire the rudiments of an education, he was expected to sit in a hard wooden bench until his spine resembled a question mark and listen to a schoolmaster who possessed the temperament of a badger with a toothache. Learning the alphabet was not a fun activity. It was a grim struggle for survival. If you failed to recognize the letter Q, you weren't met with a catchy song and a dance. You were met with a hickory switch that ensured the shape of the letter Q would be permanently embossed upon your backside. It was a system that produced either scholars or fugitives, and in my case, it managed a healthy bit of both. But by November of 1969, the American public had decided that children were far too precious to be bored. They had observed that the youth of the nation were spending their days staring at the idiot box, that flickering electronic hearth, with the glazed expression of a cow contemplating a passing freight train. A woman named Joan Gans Cooney, possessing a level of ambition usually reserved for conquering generals, decided that if children were going to be hypnotized by the television anyway, we might as well use that hypnosis to trick them into learning their vowels. Thus was born Sesame Street. It was a project funded by the government and various foundations, which is always the first sign that something truly strange is about to occur. The goal was to create a street that looked like the gritty urban heart of New York City, but without the muggings, the soot, or the pervasive smell of despair. It was to be a magical alleyway where humans and monsters coexisted in a state of perpetual singing harmony, a concept that in 1969 was considerably more far-fetched than landing a man on the moon. To populate this fantasy, they enlisted a young man named Jim Henson, who had spent his life proving that if you put your hand inside a piece of felt and move your thumb, you can convince a grown adult to tell the puppet his deepest secrets. Henson brought with him a menagerie of Muppets, creatures that defied every known law of biology. The most prominent of these was Big Bird. Now, I have seen many birds in my time, magpies, eagles, and the occasional disgruntled turkey, but I have never encountered a 6-foot-tall, bright yellow canary that possesses the intellectual curiosity of a 6-year-old and the footprint of a small dinosaur. Big Bird was the every child. He was perpetually confused, remarkably innocent, and possessed an inexplicable friendship with an invisible elephant named Mr. Snuffleupagus. In my day, if a child claimed to have a giant, invisible, shaggy friend, we didn't give him a television show. We gave him a cold compress and a dose of castor oil. But on Sesame Street, hallucination was merely another form of creative play. Then there was my personal favorite, Oscar the Grouch. Oscar was a stroke of genius. While the rest of the street was busy being sunny and telling everyone how to get there, Oscar lived in a trash can and hated everything. He was the only honest resident on the block. He understood that the world is often loud, smelly, and populated by people who want you to have a nice day, when you would much rather be left alone to count your collection of rusted sardine cans. Oscar was the patron saint of the cynical, a green, furry reminder that even in a world of sunshine and songs, there is still a place for a man, or a monster, who just wants everyone to go away and shut the door. And we must not forget the duo of Bert and Ernie. They lived together in a basement apartment and spent their days engaged in a psychological struggle that would have fascinated Freud. Ernie was a chaotic agent of mischief who played the rubber ducky and insisted on eating cookies in bed, while Bert was a man of staggering dullness who collected paper clips and obsessed over pigeons. They were the odd couple of the nursery, proving that you can truly love someone even if they drive you to the brink of a nervous breakdown every single afternoon. The true brilliance of Sesame Street, however, was its sponsors. In the commercial world, a show is brought to you by a company that wants to sell you soap or tobacco. But Sesame Street was brought to you by the letter B and the number 7. This was a magnificent piece of marketing. It treated the alphabet as if it were a high-stakes commodity. You didn't just learn the letter S, you were sold the letter S. It flashed on the screen with the urgency of a department store sale. There were animations, there were jazz riffs, and there were short films of orange juice factories, all designed to ensure that by the time a child reached kindergarten, he could identify a rectangle with the same speed a gambler identifies an ace of spades. The humans on the street, Gordon, Susan, Bob, and Mr. Hooper, were equally remarkable. They were adults who actually listened to children. They didn't shout, they didn't lecture, and they didn't seem to have any discernible jobs other than standing around the stoop and explaining why it's important to share your crayons. Mr. Hooper, in particular, ran a store where no one ever seemed to pay for anything, which explains why it was the most popular spot in the neighborhood and also why, in a real-world economy, it would have been bankrupt by Tuesday. Sesame Street was a revolution. It was the first time we admitted that the human attention span is a fragile thing, and that if you want to teach a child anything important, you have to compete with the spectacle of a circus. It turned education into a variety show. One moment you were learning about cooperation with a pair of singing monsters, and the next you were watching a film about how milk is bottled, set to a soundtrack that sounded like it was composed by a man who had spent too much time at Woodstock. I find it poetic that in the same year we were blowing up things in Vietnam and fighting over the very soul of the country, we were also obsessing over whether Cookie Monster was eating too many, sometimes, foods. Though back then, he just ate the cookies and let the crumbs fall where they may like a true hero. We were a nation in turmoil, yet we found common ground in the idea that a blue monster with googly eyes was an appropriate role model for our offspring. Did it work? Well, the children of 1969 grew up to be the adults of today. They are literate, they can count to 20, usually, and they have a strange, lingering affection for rubber duckies. But they also grew up in a world where information is delivered in 30-second segments, and where if something isn't colorful and accompanied by a puppet, they tend to lose interest. We traded the hickory stick for the Muppet, and in doing so, we created a generation that expects the truth to be brought to them by a catchy tune. I've always said that the man who does not read has no advantage over the man who cannot read. Sesame Street ensured that everyone could read, but it didn't necessarily guarantee they would read anything longer than a tweet or a cereal box. It was a grand experiment in benevolent brainwashing. It made the street a safe place, a kind place, and a place where even a grouch in a trash can had a home. As the theme song famously asked, "Can you tell me how to get to Sesame Street?" The answer, it turns out, was simple. Just turn on the television, sit down, and let the giant bird explain the world to you. It's much easier than thinking for yourself, and the songs are much better. TwAIn's Bedtime Reflection. If you must learn, learn from a monster. They have no dignity to protect, and they are remarkably consistent in their desires. A man will lie to you about his motives, but a Cookie Monster is always honest about what he wants. Now, tuck yourself in. This episode has been brought to you by the letter Z and the necessity of ZZ's. Chapter 8. The Concorde's First Whistle. In my time upon the mortal coil, I spent a significant portion of my life attempting to get from point A to point B without being blown up by a steamboat boiler or bored to death by a stagecoach driver's opinions on the local weather. Navigation was a leisurely, often perilous affair. If you wished to cross the Atlantic, you resigned yourself to 2 weeks of watching the horizon and wondering if the salt pork was intended for human consumption or as a form of nautical ballast. We moved at the pace of a tired mule, and we were grateful for it gave a man time to think, or more accurately, time to realize he had no business traveling in the first place. But the year 1969 was not a year for thinking. It was a year for hurtling. Having already decided to fire men at the moon in a giant metal firecracker, humanity looked at the Atlantic Ocean and decided that 7 hours on a Boeing 707 was an insult to the frantic nature of the modern soul. We were possessed by a new and terrible demon, the demon of velocity. We didn't just want to arrive. We wanted to arrive before we had even finished our first cocktail. The result of this collective madness was the Concorde, a machine so sleek, so white, and so impossibly fast that it looked like a needle designed to stitch the clouds together. On March 2nd, 1969, in Toulouse, France, this mechanical swan took its first flight, whistling a tune of supersonic arrogance that would eventually shake the windows of every farmhouse from Normandy to Nantucket. Now, the first miracle of the Concorde was not its engine, but its parentage. It was a joint venture between the British and the French. To the uninitiated, this may seem like a simple business arrangement. To anyone with a passing knowledge of history, it was like asking a cat and a dog to collaborate on a birdhouse. These are two nations that have spent the last 1,000 years disagreeing on everything from the proper way to cook a potato to the correct side of the road on which to court disaster. They even fought over the name. The British wanted Concorde, and the French insisted on Concorde, with an E on the end, presumably because the French believe that no word is truly finished until it has been dressed in a tiny silk scarf of unnecessary vowels. Eventually, the British minister in charge relented, claiming the E stood for excellence, England, and entente, which is the kind of linguistic retreat that keeps the peace but leaves the soul feeling slightly damp. The design of the Concorde was a direct challenge to the creator. It featured delta wings, which gave it the appearance of a paper airplane that had been built by a very angry god. But its most famous feature was the droop nose. Because the plane had to take off and land at such a steep angle, the pilots couldn't actually see the runway. They were staring directly into the heavens while the wheels were still looking for the dirt. To solve this, the engineers made the nose hinge downward, like a bashful bird looking for a worm. It is a peculiar sight, a multi-million-dollar masterpiece of engineering that has to hang its head in shame just to see where it's going. When the Concorde finally went into service, it promised to whisk the well-to-do from London to New York in 3.5 hours. This is a staggering proposition. It meant that you could leave London after a late breakfast, fly across the ocean at twice the speed of sound, and arrive in New York in time for an early breakfast on the same day. It was a form of time travel for the wealthy. It allowed a businessman to be in two places at once, which is a terrifying thought when you consider the quality of the average businessman. If you move fast enough, you can outrun your own reputation, your own shadow, and quite possibly your own conscience. Mach 2, 1,350 miles per hour, is a speed that turns the atmosphere into a solid wall. The friction was so great that the plane would actually stretch by several inches during flight, the heat of the air expanding the metal. I have known politicians who expanded their stories by similar margins, but they rarely required 4 Rolls-Royce Olympus engines to do it. However, the Concorde was not built for the silent majority I mentioned in Chapter 2. No, this was a chariot for the noisy minority. The cabin was as narrow as a hallway in a boarding house, and the seats were smaller than those on a common bus, but the inhabitants didn't care. They were being fed caviar and champagne by stewardesses who possessed the poise of duchesses, all while traveling at an altitude of 60,000 feet. At that height, the sky turns a dark, bruised purple, and you can see the curvature of the earth. It is a view traditionally reserved for angels and people who have been fired out of a cannon. It was the ultimate status symbol. If you flew the Concorde, you were telling the world that your time was so valuable that the laws of physics had to be bent to accommodate your schedule. But for all its beauty and speed, the Concorde had a fatal flaw: the sonic boom. When a plane breaks the sound barrier, it creates a shock wave that sounds like a double-barreled shotgun blast from a giant. It is the sound of the atmosphere being slapped in the face. People on the ground were not fond of this. Farmers complained that it made their cows stop giving milk. Housewives complained that it cracked their fine china. And the inhabitants of quiet villages complained that it sounded like the end of the world was being delivered by airmail twice a day. The Americans, in a fit of jealousy because they hadn't built one themselves, banned the Concorde from flying supersonic over land. This turned the plane into a white elephant with wings. It could only stretch its legs over the ocean, where the only things it could startle were the whales and the occasional confused sailor. Furthermore, the Concorde was a thirsty beast. It consumed fuel with the reckless abandon of a sailor on shore leave with a pocket full of gold. It was a beautiful, soaring technological marvel that made absolutely no financial sense whatsoever. It was a prestige project, the kind of thing a government builds when it wants to prove it is still relevant, even if it has to go bankrupt to do it. I find it delightful that we spent the better part of a decade and billions of pounds and francs to create a way to cross the Atlantic in 3 hours, only to realize that once we got to the other side, we didn't actually have anything more important to do than we did when it took 2 weeks. We increased the speed of life, but we didn't increase the quality of it. We just made it possible to be bored in London and bored in New York on the same morning. The Concorde was the last gasp of the age of optimism. It was a world that believed speed was synonymous with progress. On that day in March 1969, as the prototype 001 lifted off the runway, it looked like the future. It looked like a world where we would all be zip-pity zooming around the globe, dining on the edge of space and laughing at the slow pokes below. But the future had other plans. The future wanted economy class, carry-on baggage fees, and plastic security bins. The Concorde was a gentleman in a world that was becoming a crowd. It was too fast, too loud, and far too expensive for a species that would eventually decide that the height of luxury was a seat that reclined 3 inches and a free bag of pretzels. Still, one must tip one's hat to the old bird. It was a magnificent folly. It was a whistle in the dark, a silver streak across the sky that reminded us that for a brief, shining moment in 1969, we were bold enough to try and beat the sun in a race across the Atlantic. We lost, of course. The sun has a much better fuel contract, but we sure did look good trying. TwAIn's bedtime admonition: speed is a grand thing, provided you're going somewhere worth getting to. If you're just rushing toward your own demise, you might as well take the slow boat and enjoy the salt pork. Now close your eyes and imagine the sonic boom is just the sound of the world's most expensive door closing on the decade. Sleep fast. You have a long day of being stationary ahead of you. Chapter 9. The Trial of the Chicago 7. I have always held that a courtroom is merely a theater, where the actors are paid by the taxpayer and the script is written in a language, legalese, specifically designed to prevent the average man from understanding how he is being swindled. In the autumn of 1969, however, the United States government decided to do away with the pretense of dignity and stage a full-blown variety show in the city of Chicago. They called it a trial for conspiracy. But to anyone with a discerning eye, it was a high-stakes comedy of errors where the law and the counterculture met head-on and both sides walked away looking remarkably foolish. The cast of characters was a collection of souls so diverse and discordant that they could only have been assembled by a divine prankster or a very desperate prosecutor. You had the yippies, the pacifists, the intellectuals, and the Black Panthers all lumped together into one convenient bucket of radicalism. The government's premise was that these 8 men, it started as 8, but math has never been the government's strong suit, had conspired to cross state lines with the express intent of starting a riot at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Now, conspiracy is a wonderful word for a prosecutor. It suggests a dark, smoky room where men in cloaks whisper about overrunning the Bastille. In reality, getting these 8 men to conspire on anything, including the lunch order, would have required a miracle of biblical proportions. They agreed on approximately nothing, except perhaps for the fact that the government was a nuisance and the war in Vietnam was a catastrophe. The two Hoffmans. The centerpiece of this circus was the relationship between the 2 men who shared a surname but absolutely nothing else, Judge Julius Hoffman and the defendant Abbie Hoffman. Judge Julius was a man of small stature and a temper that suggested he had spent his entire life being told he wasn't tall enough for the carnival rides. He possessed a judicial philosophy that could be summarized as, if you have long hair and a loud voice, you are clearly guilty of something, and I shall find it. He viewed his courtroom as a sacred cathedral, and himself as the high priest who had run out of patience with the congregation. Abbie Hoffman, on the other hand, was a master of the put-on. He was a man who understood that if you want to defeat a man like Julius, you don't argue with him. You make him the punchline of a joke he doesn't understand. Abbie entered the courtroom not as a defendant, but as a performer. He would blow kisses to the jury, do handstands in the aisle, and once, famously, he and Jerry Rubin appeared in court wearing judicial robes. When the judge ordered them to remove the robes, they did so, only to reveal that they were wearing Chicago police uniforms underneath. It was a stroke of genius. It reduced the majesty of the law to the level of a costume party. If the judge is just a man in a robe and the defendants are just men in robes, then the only difference between them is who has the gavel. And in Chicago in 1969, the gavel was being wielded with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The gagging of Bobby Seale. The proceedings took a dark and truly absurd turn with the treatment of Bobby Seale, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party. Seale had been included in the indictment despite only being in Chicago for a few hours and having never met most of his co-conspirators. He demanded his constitutional right to represent himself, a request that Judge Julius denied with the regularity of a ticking clock. Seale, not being a man to suffer fools or judicial tyranny in silence, continued to protest. He called the judge a pig, a fascist, and a racist, terms which, in 1969, were the verbal equivalent of tossing a lit firecracker into a henhouse. The judge's solution was not to address the legal merits of Seale's complaint, but to literally bind and gag him. For several days, a defendant in a federal trial sat at the defense table wrapped in chains and silenced by a cloth gag. It was a visual metaphor so potent it would have made a Victorian satirist weep with envy. The government was attempting to prove that these men were a threat to order, and in doing so, they created a scene of such manifest disorder and cruelty that the law itself looked like the criminal. Eventually, the judge realized that a gagged black man in a courtroom is a very bad look for a democracy, and Seal's case was severed from the rest. Thus, the Chicago 8 became the Chicago 7. A trial of intent. The trial dragged on for 5 months. It was a battle of generations played out in a room filled with oak paneling and dust. The prosecution's case rested on the idea of intent. In the eyes of the law, it wasn't just about what you did, it was about what you intended to do when you crossed a state line. This is a dangerous path for any government to walk. If we start arresting people for their intentions, I suspect the jails would be filled with husbands, taxpayers, and anyone who has ever sat through a 3-hour opera. The defense, led by William Kunstler, a man whose hair appeared to be in a permanent state of electrical shock, argued that the riot wasn't a conspiracy of the defendants, but a police riot caused by a city government that viewed a peace sign as a declaration of war. The testimony was a parade of the bizarre. They called folk singers like Arlo Guthrie and Country Joe McDonald to testify. They discussed the Pegasus incident, the time the Yippies tried to nominate a literal pig for the presidency. The pig, I'm told, was the only candidate in 1968 who was entirely honest about his platform, which mostly involved eating corn and rolling in the mud. The defendants treated the trial like a happening. They read poetry, they brought in birthday cakes, and they turned the witness stand into a pulpit for the new left. Dave Dellinger, a middle-aged pacifist who looked like a high school principal, would calmly explain the principles of nonviolence, while the judge turned a shade of purple, usually reserved for overripe plums. The verdict and the folly. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, they were as confused as a termite in a yo-yo factory. They eventually acquitted all 7 defendants of the conspiracy charge, proving that even a Chicago jury couldn't believe these men could agree on a plan to tie their own shoelaces. However, they found 5 of them guilty of the individual charge of crossing state lines to incite a riot. Judge Julius, determined to have the last word, then sentenced the defendants and their lawyers to staggering terms for contempt of court. He handed out years of prison time for things like laughing, slumping in a chair, and calling the judge by his first name. It was the ultimate tantrum of an ego that had been bruised by the irreverence of youth. Of course, in the grand tradition of American justice, almost all of the convictions were later overturned on appeal. The higher courts pointed out that Judge Julius had been about as impartial as a hungry cat in a room full of mice. The trial ended not with a bang of justice, but with a whimper of legal exhaustion. Looking back, the trial of the Chicago 7 stands as a monument to the fact that you cannot solve a cultural revolution with a subpoena. The government tried to put the 60s on trial, and all they succeeded in doing was proving that the establishment had lost its sense of humor. And once you lose your sense of humor, you have already lost the war. I've always said that against the assault of laughter, nothing can stand. Abby Hoffman knew this. Judge Julius did not. One of them went to jail, briefly, and the other remained on the bench. But history remembers the man who wore the judicial robes as a joke, not the man who wore them as a shroud for his own insecurities. TwAIn's bedtime verdict: the law is a magnificent thing, but it is rarely a sensible one. If you ever find yourself in a courtroom, remember to wear a tie, keep your mouth shut, and never, under any circumstances, try to nominate a pig for high office. It's bad for the pig, And it's even worse for the judge's blood pressure. Now go to sleep before I hold you in contempt of bedtime. Chapter 10. The Butch Cassidy Premise. In my younger and more adventurous days, before I became a professional monument to my own reputation, I spent a fair amount of time in the American West. I have seen real outlaws. I have seen men whose faces looked like a topographical map of a particularly violent landslide and whose personal hygiene was a direct violation of several Mosaic laws. A real miscreant of the 1890s did not possess a full set of teeth, let alone a witty repertoire of banter and a perfectly coiffed head of hair. If you encountered a train robber in the Nevada Territory, he didn't charm you with his blue eyes. He usually just took your watch and left you with a lingering sense of regret and a dusty coat. But in September of 1969, Hollywood decided that the Old West had been far too dusty and unattractive. They released a motion picture called Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and in doing so, they convinced the world that being a career criminal was essentially a high-spirited romp through the countryside with your most handsome friend. It was a film that suggested that as long as you were incredibly charming and possessed the jawline of a Greek god, the fact that you were a thief and a menace to society was merely a delightful character quirk. The pulchritude of the persecuted. The casting of this epic was the first sign that reality had been asked to leave the room. They chose Paul Newman to play Butch Cassidy and Robert Redford to play the Sundance Kid. Now, I have seen a photograph of the real Butch Cassidy. He looked like a man who worked in a butcher shop and occasionally had trouble with his taxes. He did not look like Paul Newman. Paul Newman possessed eyes so blue they could make a blind man weep with envy, and a smile that suggested he had never spent a single night sleeping on a cactus. Robert Redford, as Sundance, looked like he had just stepped out of a shampoo advertisement rather than a 3-day ride through the Wyoming wilderness. To put these two men together on a screen was a form of visual assault. It made every other man in the audience feel like a gargoyle. The premise of the film was simple. These two outlaws were the last of a dying breed, being pursued by a super posse that represented the cold, unfeeling hand of progress. But when the outlaws look like they belong on a pedestal in a museum of fine arts, it's very difficult to root for the sheriff. The intrusion of the two-wheeled demon. There is a scene in the film that perfectly captures the New West of 1969. Butch Cassidy, a man whose livelihood depends on the speed of a horse, decides to entertain a lady by riding a bicycle. I have an old and bitter feud with the bicycle. I once attempted to master the ordinary bicycle, that ridiculous contraption with a wheel the size of a Ferris wheel and a seat that was designed by a grand inquisitor. I learned that the only way to stay on a bicycle is to move at a speed that makes a crash inevitable. In the movie, Butch rides around to a song called "Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head," which is a tune so relentlessly cheerful it makes you want to go out and start a small war. The bicycle represents the end of the outlaw era. It is a machine of peace, of civility, and of bruised shins. When Butch Cassidy says, "The future's all around us," while wobbling on two wheels, he isn't just talking about transportation. He's talking about a world where you can't rob a train anymore because the train has a schedule, a telegraph, and a very large insurance policy. The leap of faith. and lack of swimming. The most famous moment in the film, and perhaps in all of 1969 cinema, is the cliff jump. Butch and Sundance are cornered by the super posse. Below them is a roaring river. Behind them is a group of men who are paid to be humorless and accurate with a rifle. Butch suggests they jump. Sundance hesitates. He looks at the raging torrent and admits, with a staggering lack of bravado, "I can't swim." This is a magnificent bit of writing. It humanizes the legend. It reminds us that even a man who can outshoot a dozen deputies can be defeated by a large puddle. Butch's response is equally brilliant. "Why, you crazy fool? The fall will probably kill you anyway." They jump, they survive, and they go to Bolivia. Now, I have never been to Bolivia, but based on the film, it is a place where the dirt is even dustier than Wyoming, the language is impossible to learn, and the law is even more persistent. The film treats their South American adventure as a slow-motion tragedy, a beautiful death. They realize they are dinosaurs in a world of mammals. They are outlaws in a world of lawyers. The freeze frame of glory. The film ends with what is known as a freeze frame. Our heroes emerge from a building, guns blazing, facing an entire army. The image stops. We don't see them die. We see them in their final moment of defiance, forever young, forever handsome, and forever refusing to get a real job. This was exactly what the audience in 1969 wanted. They were tired of the news. They were tired of the war, the riots, and the politicians with their silent majorities. They wanted to believe that somewhere out on the fringes of the world, there were two men who didn't care about the rules, who valued friendship above gold, and who could face certain death with a witty remark. The Butch Cassidy premise is the idea that the only way to survive the modern world is to find a partner you can trust, learn to laugh at the absurdity of your situation, and, if all else fails, be prepared to jump off the cliff. It is a beautiful and thoroughly dishonest version of history, and I loved every minute of it. It proved that Hollywood could take a couple of dusty bank robbers and turn them into the patron saints of the counterculture. It reminded us that while the super posse of reality is always gaining on us, they can never catch us as long as the film is running and the song is playing. I've always said that the secret of getting ahead is getting started. Butch and Sundance were always starting over, new towns, new banks, new countries. They were the ultimate entrepreneurs of chaos. They didn't have a plan. They just had a feeling and a very high tolerance for being shot at. And in the year 1969, that felt like the most sensible way to live. TwAIn's bedtime observation: if you ever find yourself being chased by a super posse, do not stop to check your hair in a mirror. Unless, of course, you are Robert Redford, in which case the posse will likely stop and ask for your autograph, allowing you to escape to Bolivia in peace. Now, close your eyes and imagine you are riding a bicycle through a field of daisies. The future is all around you, but for tonight, the past is a much more comfortable place to sleep. Just stay away from the cliffs. Chapter 11. The Stonewall Uprising. In my day, public morality was a commodity managed by a collection of grim-faced deacons and elderly aunts who believed that if a person were having a good time, they were almost certainly violating a celestial ordinance. We were a society of layers, petticoats, corsets, and heavy wool coats, designed to hide the fact that we were humans at all. If a man possessed a temperament that didn't align with the rigid geometry of a Victorian parlor, he was expected to keep that information locked in a trunk in the attic, right next to the family's secret recipes and the uncle who thought he was a turnip. But by June of 1969, the attic was full, the trunk was bursting, and the people of New York City were beginning to find that the morality being forced upon them by the local constabulary had the shelf life of a dead fish in a heat wave. The center of this particular storm was the establishment in Greenwich Village called the Stonewall Inn. Now, to call it an inn is a bit of a stretch. It suggests a quaint fireplace and a host who offers you a warm muffin and a copy of the Times. In reality, it was a dark, windowless bar run by the mafia, where the beer was watered down and the atmosphere was mostly composed of cigarette smoke and desperation. But for a certain segment of the population, the outcasts, the drifters, the transvestites, and the homosexuals, words the 1969 newspapers used with the same delicacy a cat uses when encountering a vacuum cleaner, it was a palace. It was the one place where they could be themselves without the world asking for an apology. The Public Moral Squad. The antagonists of our story were the members of the Public Moral Squad. I have always found that title to be one of the most delicious ironies in the history of civil service. It suggests a group of men who go about the city ensuring that everyone is being kind to their mothers and reading their Bibles. In practice, it meant a group of undercover policemen who spent their evenings lurking in bars, trying to trick people into being unusual so they could arrest them for the crime of indecency. It is a peculiar way to earn a paycheck. A man wakes up, kisses his wife, eats his eggs, and then spends 8 hours trying to catch someone else wearing the wrong kind of hat or dancing with the wrong person. It suggests a level of obsession with other people's private lives that would make a village gossip look like a hermit. On the night of June 28, 1969, the Public Moral Squad decided to raid the Stonewall Inn. This was a routine occurrence. The police would show up, turn on the lights, insult everyone, arrest a few people who didn't have 3 pieces of gender-appropriate clothing on their person. Yes, that was a law that suggests the government had a very specific and very boring vision for everyone's wardrobe. And then everyone would go home feeling miserable. But that night, the script was thrown out the window. The resistance of the resplendent. Usually, when the police arrived, the patrons of the Stonewall would scatter like pigeons in a park. But on this night, the heat was stifling, the atmosphere was charged, and the people were simply tired. They were tired of being hide-and-seek champions. They were tired of the public morals being practiced by men who took bribes from the mob to let the bars stay open in the first place. As the police began to load people into the paddy wagons, a crowd gathered outside on Christopher Street. It wasn't a silent crowd. It was a crowd that began to boo. Then they began to jeer. Then, in a moment of pure genius, they began to throw coins at the police. It was a symbolic gesture of the highest order. They were paying off the cops, mocking the system of payoffs that had governed the village for years. It was as if to say, if you're going to treat us like criminals, we might as well pay the entrance fee. Then came the bottles, then the bricks, and then came the most formidable weapon in the history of civil unrest, the high-heeled shoe. The kick line of defiance. I have seen the charge of the Light Brigade, and I have read of the great infantry movements of the Civil War, but I suspect none of them possess the sheer terrifying audacity of the Stonewall Kick Line. As the Tactical Police Force, the TPF, a group of men dressed in helmets and carrying shields, looking like they were ready to invade a small country, arrived to restore order, they were met with a chorus line. A group of drag queens and street youths linked arms and began to perform a high-kicking dance right in the faces of the armed officers. They sang a little ditty. We are the Stonewall Girls / we wear our hair in curls / we don't wear underwear / we show our pubic hair. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. How does a man with a baton and a shield react to a person in a wig and sequins doing a can-can in the middle of a riot? The police manual doesn't cover this. It is impossible to maintain your dignity as a representative of the state when you are being out-glamored by a person who hasn't had a proper meal in 3 days. The riot lasted for 6 days, off and on. It was a chaotic, beautiful, messy explosion of humanity. It wasn't just about a bar. It was about the right to exist in the sunlight. It was the moment when the silent minority of the shadows decided that they were no longer going to be silent, and they certainly weren't going to be a minority if they could help it. The aftermath and the pride. Before Stonewall, the movement for gay rights consisted of a few brave souls in suits and ties walking in a quiet circle and asking politely for the right to be left alone. After Stonewall, it became a parade. The following year, they held the first Christopher Street Liberation Day March. They didn't ask for permission. They took the street. They realized that if you want the world to change, you have to be loud enough to wake the neighbors, and you have to be colorful enough that they can't look away. I find it delightful that the Public Moral Squad actually succeeded in their mission, though not in the way they intended. By raiding that bar, they forced the morality of the situation into the open. They proved that the real indecency wasn't a man in a dress. It was a government that used its power to bully the vulnerable. The Stonewall Uprising didn't solve everything, of course. Prejudice is a hardy weed that can grow in any soil. But it changed the vibe of the decade. It moved the conversation from the dark corners of the inn to the center of the street. It proved that a well-placed brick or a well-timed kick can do more for the human spirit than 100 polite letters to the editor. I've always said that loyalty to petrified opinion never yet broke a chain or freed a human soul. The people at Stonewall broke their chains with style. They decided that if they were going to be outcasts, they were going to be the most fabulous outcast the world had ever seen. And as the sun rose over Greenwich Village that Sunday morning, the world was a little more colorful, a little louder, and a great deal more honest than it had been when the lights were out. TwAIn's bedtime observation. If you ever find yourself in a riot, try to be the one with the best shoes. If you can't win the fight, you can at least win the fashion show. And in the long run, history tends to remember the person who looked the best while being arrested. Now close your eyes and dream of a world where everyone can dance with whomever they please, provided they don't step on anyone's toes. Sleep well. The parade starts early tomorrow, and you'll want to be in the front row. Chapter 12. The Chappaquiddick Splash. I have always observed that water is a remarkably honest substance. It has no politics, no social ambitions, and a refreshing lack of respect for a man's pedigree. If you fall into a river, it does not matter if your ancestors arrived on the Mayflower or if they were recently invited to leave a debtor's prison in London. The water will treat you with the same cold, damp indifference. However, in the year 1969, we discovered that while water may be indifferent, the land, specifically that patch of it occupied by the American political machine, is capable of performing miracles of buoyancy that would baffle a physicist. In July of that year, while the eyes of the world were turned toward the heavens to watch three men play in the lunar dust, a much smaller and considerably more damp drama was unfolding on a tiny spit of sand off the coast of Massachusetts called Chappaquiddick. It was here that Senator Edward Ted Kennedy, the last surviving scion of a dynasty that viewed the United States government as a family-owned subsidiary, decided to engage in a piece of nocturnal navigation that would forever alter the trajectory of his career and provide a masterclass in the art of the political fog. The setting of the calamity. Chappaquiddick is an island that is mostly composed of scrub brush, sand, and the kind of exclusive privacy that wealthy people pay a great deal of money to maintain. It is a place where one goes to get away from it all. And in the summer of '69, the all included the prying eyes of the press and the nagging constraints of common sense. The senator had hosted a party at a rented cottage for a group of young women known as the Boiler Room Girls, a title that suggests they were involved in a high-pressure engineering project, but they were actually campaign workers for his late brother Robert. By all accounts, it was a jovial affair. There was music, there was conversation, and there was likely enough distilled spirits to float a small schooner. Around midnight, the senator decided it was time to depart. He climbed into his Oldsmobile Delmont 88, a car the size of a comfortable living room, with a young lady named Mary Jo Kopechne. His intention, he later claimed, was to take her to the ferry so she could return to her hotel. However, the senator, a man who had navigated the complex corridors of the United States Senate for years, apparently found a simple dirt road on a tiny island to be an unsolvable labyrinth. Instead of turning left toward the ferry, he turned right toward Dyke Bridge. Now, I have seen bridges in my time. I have seen majestic spans across the Mississippi and sturdy stone arches in the Alps. Dyke Bridge was none of these. It was a narrow wooden contrivance that lacked guardrails and seemed to have been constructed by someone who had a personal grudge against the concept of safety. It was not a bridge for a man in a hurry, nor was it a bridge for an Oldsmobile driven by a man whose internal compass was currently spinning like a dervish. The splash and the long walk. The car left the bridge and plunged into the dark, brackish waters of Poocha Pond. The Oldsmobile turned turtle, settling into the mud and trapping Mary Jo inside. The senator, through a miracle of luck, or perhaps a desperate burst of athletic prowess, managed to escape the submerged vehicle. At this point, a normal man, a man not burdened by the weight of a legendary surname, would have likely run to the nearest house, pounded on the door until his knuckles bled, and screamed for the police, the fire department, and anyone with a rope and a flashlight. He would have been a man possessed by a singular, frantic purpose to save the life of the woman he had just deposited in the drink. But Ted Kennedy was not a normal man. He was a Kennedy, And a Kennedy's first instinct, even when soaking wet and coughing up pond water, is to consider how the situation will look in the morning editions of the Boston Globe. According to his own testimony, he dove back into the water several times to try and save Mary Jo, but the current was too strong. Exhausted and presumably in a state of shock, a medical condition that in politics is often indistinguishable from a sudden desire to consult with a lawyer, he didn't go to the nearest house, which happened to be only a few hundred yards away and had a light on. Instead, he walked back to the cottage where the party was still in progress. He summoned two of his closest associates. Did they call the police? No. They went back to the bridge, dove into the water themselves, failed to reach the car, and then the story enters the realm of the fantastic. The senator swam across the channel to the main island, a feat of endurance that suggests his shock was remarkably selective, returned to his hotel, changed his clothes, and allegedly went to sleep. The 10-hour silence. For the next 10 hours, while Mary Jo Kopechne remained in that submerged Oldsmobile, the Senator of the United States did nothing. He spoke to the hotel manager about a noise complaint. He chatted with a friend about the weather. He behaved for all the world like a man who had spent his evening reading a dull book, rather than one who had just presided over a fatal accident. He didn't report the crash to the police until the following morning, after the car had already been discovered by two fishermen. When he finally appeared at the police station, he was wearing a neck brace. I have noticed that a neck brace is the favorite costume of a politician in trouble. It is a visual shorthand for "I am the real victim here." It suggests that while the other person may be dead, the politician has a very stiff neck, and really, isn't that just as tragic in its own way? The moral compass speech. The fallout was handled with the kind of strategic brilliance usually reserved for a military invasion. The senator went on television a week later to deliver a speech that was written by a committee of the finest legal and literary minds in the country. It was a masterpiece of Victorian melodrama. He spoke of the Kennedy curse. He wondered aloud if some awful curse did actually hang over all the Kennedys. This is a magnificent bit of deflection. If a man drives his car off a bridge through his own negligence, it is usually called bad driving. But if a Kennedy does it, it is fate. It is the gods of Olympus acting out a tragedy. It shifts the blame from the man behind the wheel to the stars in the sky. He asked the people of Massachusetts to help him decide if he should resign, knowing full well that the people of Massachusetts would sooner vote for a ham sandwich than see a Kennedy leave office in disgrace. The speech worked in a way. He didn't go to jail. He received a 2-month suspended sentence for leaving the scene of an accident, a punishment so light it could have been delivered by a feather duster. The public morals I mentioned in the previous chapter apparently didn't apply to the inhabitants of Hyannis Port. The cosmic irony of 1969. The ultimate irony of Chappaquiddick is its timing. The car went into the pond on July 18th. 2 days later, on July the 20th, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. One man reached the pinnacle of human achievement, traveling 250,000 miles through the void to expand the boundaries of our species. Another man couldn't manage to cross a 100-foot bridge without ending up in the muck. One man brought us the future. The other reminded us of the oldest story in the book, that power and privilege are the best life jackets ever invented. The moon landing effectively buried the Chappaquiddick story on the back pages for a week. The giant leap for mankind provided a convenient shadow for the small splash for a senator. By the time the world stopped looking at the moon, the Kennedy machine had already paved over the facts with a thick layer of confusion and concussion. Chappaquiddick didn't end Ted Kennedy's career. He stayed in the Senate for another 40 years. But it did kill his chance of ever becoming president. The White House became his own moon, a distant shining object he could look at but never touch. The American public was willing to overlook a great deal, but even they had a hard time trusting a man who, when faced with a crisis, decided the best course of action was to take a nap and wait for the morning papers. I've always said that truth is stranger than fiction, but it is because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities. Truth isn't. If you had written a story about a senator who left a girl in a pond and then went to sleep in a hotel, nobody would have believed it. It would have been dismissed as a cruel satire. But in 1969, it was just another Saturday morning in Massachusetts. TwAIn's bedtime warning. If you ever find yourself behind the wheel of an Oldsmobile on a dark night, remember that bridges are for crossing, not for diving. And if you do happen to take a splash, try to remember that the police station is a much better place to visit than the hotel bar. Now, close your eyes and dream of the moon. It's a much safer place to be than Chappaquiddick. At least there, everyone can see you coming, and there are no bridges to miss. Sleep well and mind the damp. Chapter 13. Midnight. Cowboy wins big. In my day, a cowboy was a reasonably straightforward creature. He was a man of few words, fewer baths, and a singular devotion to a four-legged animal that was usually smarter than he was. He lived under the vast, uncaring canopy of the western sky, and his primary contributions to civilization were the occasional herding of beef and the creation of a legendary reputation for stoicism that he hadn't actually earned. If you had told a citizen of the 1870s that a cowboy would one day be the subject of a motion picture rated X and honored with the highest accolades of the American film industry, he would have assumed the world had finally succumbed to a fit of collective sunstroke. But the year 1969 was not a year for the traditional hero. We had already seen Butch and Sundance, Chapter 10, turn outlawry into a fashion statement. However, Hollywood decided that even that was too cheerful. They wanted to take the American dream, drag it into a damp alleyway in Manhattan, and beat it over the head with a transistor radio. The result was Midnight Cowboy, a film that proved you could win an Oscar by being the most depressed person in a room full of people who were already fairly miserable. The rating of the forbidden. The most remarkable thing about Midnight Cowboy, aside from the fact that it is a very fine piece of work, is that it remains the only X-rated film ever to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. Now, when the modern citizen hears the letter X in relation to a film, his mind immediately wanders toward the prurient, the scandalous, and the kind of entertainment that is best viewed while wearing a disguise and sitting in the back row of a theater with a suspicious name. But in 1969, the X was a badge of adult seriousness. It meant that the film contained ideas and realities that were considered too gritty for the fragile sensibilities of the American teenager, who, at the time, was busy dodging the draft and participating in riots, but apparently couldn't handle the sight of a Texan looking for love in the wrong places. The Motion Picture Association of America had just invented the rating system, and they gave Midnight Cowboy an X because it dealt with homosexual overtones and the general grime of life on 42nd Street. It is a peculiar sort of morality that allows a film to show 1,000 people being blown up in a war, but considers a quiet moment of human desperation to be pornographic. The Naive Stud from Texas. The story concerns one Joe Buck, played by a young John Voight, with a face so earnest it made you want to buy him a glass of milk and tell him to go home to his mother. Joe is a dishwasher from Texas who decides that his true calling in life is to be a hustler for wealthy women in New York City. This is the ultimate American delusion, the belief that one's natural gifts, in this case a cowboy hat, some cowhide fringe, and a sturdy physique, are a commodity that the rest of the world is dying to purchase. Joe Buck arrives in New York with a transistor radio pressed to his ear and a swagger that suggests he owns the pavement. He thinks he is a predator entering a jungle. He doesn't realize he is a lamb wandering into a meat-packing district. New York City in 1969 was not the New York of the postcards. It was a place where the air was composed of equal parts soot and indifference. It was a city that looked at Joe Buck's fringe and cowboy boots and didn't see a hero. It saw a mark. The grifter and the grease. Enter Rizzo, played by Dustin Hoffman, in a performance that consisted of equal parts cough, limp, and grease. Ratso is a small-time conman, a human scavenger who lives in a condemned building and dreams of moving to Florida, a place he imagines is a neon paradise where his health will miraculously return and he won't have to steal for a living. The relationship between Joe and Ratso is one of the most touching and bizarre friendships in the history of the screen. It is a partnership of the doomed. Ratso cons Joe out of his last $20, and then, in a fit of inexplicable guilt or perhaps just a need for company, invites him to live in his squalid, unheated room. There is a scene in the film that has become part of the American lexicon. As they are walking across a busy street, a taxi nearly hits them. Hoffman, staying perfectly in character, slaps the hood of the car and yells, "I'm walking here! I'm walking here!" It was an improvised moment. The taxi had actually driven onto the set by mistake, but it captured the spirit of the era perfectly. It was the cry of the individual against the machine. It was the sound of a man who has nothing left but his own presence on a patch of asphalt. In 1969, everyone felt like they were walking here, and the world was trying its best to run them over. The party and the parody. As the film progresses, the two men descend further into poverty and illness. They attend a Warhol-esque party filled with the beautiful people of the underground, a collection of souls who are so hip they have forgotten how to have a conversation. It is a brilliant parody of the very counterculture that was supposedly liberating the country. The film suggests that whether you are a wealthy socialite in a penthouse or a grifter in a basement, you are still essentially alone, clutching your own private misery like a holy relic. This was the new Hollywood philosophy, that the only honest ending is a sad one. The days of the hero riding into the sunset were over. Now the hero died on a Greyhound bus just as it crossed the Florida state line. The Oscar for misery. When the Academy Awards rolled around in April of 1970, honoring the films of '69, the voters had a choice. They could have chosen the musical Hello, Dolly, a film that looked like it had been preserved in sugar since 1954. They could have chosen Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which was fun, handsome, and safe. Instead, they chose the X-rated story of a failed hustler and a dying grifter. It was a staggering moment. It meant that the establishment, the elderly tuxedo-wearing members of the Academy, had finally admitted that the world had changed. They recognized that the American dream was currently coughing up blood and that the cowboy was no longer a symbol of expansion, but a symbol of displacement. Midnight Cowboy won Best Picture, Best Director for John Schlesinger, and Best Adapted Screenplay. It was a victory for the gritty, the ugly, and the true. It proved that in the year 1969, a movie didn't need a happy ending to be a winner. It just needed to be honest about how much it hurt to be alive. I find it amusing that we spent the entire decade trying to find ourselves, and when we finally did, we found out we were Dustin Hoffman in a dirty undershirt, shivering in a room without a radiator. It is the ultimate joke. We fought for freedom, and we ended up with the freedom to be miserable in a brand new way. The legacy of the gritty. Midnight Cowboy paved the way for a decade of serious cinema. It told filmmakers that they didn't have to hide the dirt under the rug anymore. They could show the alleyways, the broken hearts, and the X-rated realities of the human condition. But I suspect that if the real Butch Cassidy had seen the film, he would have been thoroughly confused. "Why," he would ask, "is that boy wearing my clothes and crying in a bus? And why didn't he just rob the bank in the first place?" The answer, Butch, is that by 1969, there were no more banks to rob that hadn't already been looted by the government, and the only thing left to steal was a little bit of dignity. And as Joe Buck discovered, that's the hardest heist of all. TwAIn's bedtime consideration: if you ever find yourself in New York City with a cowboy hat and a dream, keep your hand on your wallet and your eyes on the traffic. And if a man named Ratso offers you a room, remember that free is often the most expensive price you can pay. Now close your eyes and dream of Florida, the version with the orange juice and the sunshine, not the version with the Greyhound bus. Sleep well. The world is still walking here. But for tonight, you can stay exactly where you are. Chapter 14. The Manson Folly. I have often observed that if you give a man a respectable job, a decent suit, and a purpose in life, he will generally remain a productive, if somewhat dull, member of the human race. But if you take that same man, deprive him of any discernible talent, marinate him in the penal systems of several Western states, and then release him into the sun-drenched, patchouli-scented madness of California in the late 60s, you are not merely asking for trouble. You are issuing it a formal invitation to dinner. In August of 1969, just as the world was recovering from the dust of the moon and the mud of Woodstock, a gentleman by the name of Charles Manson decided to remind us that the age of Aquarius had a basement, and it was filled with some of the most specialized lunacy ever conceived by a mind that had spent too much time reading the book of Revelation through a haze of illicit chemistry. The pocket-sized Rasputin. Now, to look at Charles Manson was not to look upon a titan of evil. He was a small, scruffy individual who appeared to have been constructed entirely out of pipe cleaners and unwashed hair. He was what I would call a third-rate grifter, a man who, in my day, would have been run out of town on a rail for trying to sell a miracle tonic that was mostly turpentine and creek water. He was a failed singer-songwriter, a profession that usually results in nothing more dangerous than a few bored patrons at a coffee house. But Manson possessed the one quality that is more dangerous than a loaded Gatling gun: the ability to find people who were even more confused than he was. He gathered a family of middle-class runaways, young women and men who had decided that their parents' suburban lives were plastic, and that the logical alternative was to live in a desert ranch, eat out of dumpsters, and listen to a 5'2" man explain how the Beatles were sending him secret messages through their record albums. The movie set nightmare. The headquarters for this spiritual endeavor was the Spahn Ranch, an old dilapidated film set used for westerns. There is a delicious irony in the fact that this real-life horror show was staged on a fake movie set. It was a place where order had once been performed for the cameras, now occupied by a group of people who believed they were preparing for a racial apocalypse they called Helter Skelter. Manson's philosophy was a stew of fragments. He took a bit of the Bible, a dash of Scientology, a heavy dose of drug-induced paranoia, and a profound misunderstanding of the Beatles' White Album. He believed that the song Blackbird was an invitation for a global uprising, and that he, Charles, was the fifth Beatle, the one who would lead the survivors from a hole in the ground in Death Valley. I have spent my life playing with words, and I can tell you that if a man hears a song about a bird with broken wings and concludes that he should start a revolution by hiding in a cave, that man has a short circuit in his mental wiring that no amount of meditation is going to fix. The Hollywood Panic. In early August, the family descended upon the hills of Hollywood. The events that followed were tragic, senseless, and, in the cold light of history, a staggering display of human folly. They targeted the home of film director Roman Polanski and his wife, Sharon Tate. The brutality of the crimes is well documented, but the effect on the city of Los Angeles was a masterpiece of farce. Suddenly, the beautiful people who had been preaching peace, love, and the dismantling of the establishment realized that the establishment was the only thing standing between them and a group of barefoot lunatics with knives. The gates of Bel Air were slammed shut. The sale of guard dogs reached a fever pitch. People who had been dropping out the week before were now frantically dropping back in and checking the locks on their doors. It was a moment of profound realization. The love they had been celebrating was a fragile thing, and the peace was only possible as long as everyone played by the rules they were currently trying to abolish. The Trial of the Century, Part 2. The trial of Manson and his girls, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, was a circus that made the Chicago 7, Chapter 9, look like a quiet afternoon in a library. Manson appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead, claiming he had been X'd out of society. His followers promptly carved X's into their own foreheads. I have always maintained that if you want to belong to a club, you should probably find one that has a better membership requirement than facial mutilation. They sang songs on the way to the courtroom. They giggled. They shouted insults at the judge. Manson even attempted to leap over the defense table to attack the magistrate, a move that suggests he had been watching too many of the westerns filmed at his ranch. It was a performance designed to show that they didn't care for the laws of man, which is a very easy position to take until the laws of man decide to put you in a small room for the rest of your natural life. The prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, turned the trial into a grand narrative of the helter-skelter conspiracy. He spent months explaining Manson's convoluted theories to a jury of regular citizens who likely went home every night and hugged their pillows. The end of the rainbow. The Manson murders acted as a cold shower for the decade. If the Beatles on the Roof was the high point of 1969 and the moon landing was the grand achievement, the Manson Folly was the grim reality check. It proved that freedom without responsibility is merely a fancy word for chaos. The hippies didn't look so charming anymore. The long hair and the fringe now carried a hint of the Spawn Ranch stench. The media, which had been fascinated by the counterculture, now looked at it with a mixture of suspicion and fear. We had spent the year reaching for the stars in the age of Aquarius, only to find that the stars were indifferent and the Aquarius was leaking. I find it poetic that Manson wanted to be famous. He wanted to be a star. In a way, he succeeded, but he became the kind of star that only shines in the dark. He became a cautionary tale, a reminder that when you tear down the fences of civilization, you shouldn't be surprised when the wolves come in to sleep on your sofa. Manson spent nearly 50 years in prison, long enough to see his helter-skelter become nothing more than a footnote in a history book and a very long song by the Beatles. He died as he lived, a small, loud man who thought he was a king, but who was actually just a reminder that the human brain is a delicate instrument that should never be left in the sun too long without a hat. TwAIn's bedtime consideration: if a man in a desert tells you he's the Messiah, ask to see his credentials. If his credentials consist of a broken guitar and a plan to live in a hole, walk, do not run, in the opposite direction. Now close your eyes and be grateful for your locks, your neighbors, and the fact that you don't hear voices in your record player. Sleep well. The desert is far away, and the only family you need to worry about are the ones who will want to borrow your lawnmower in the morning. Chapter 15. Monty Python's Flying Circus. For the better part of several centuries, the British Empire was managed by a collection of gentlemen who believed that the primary purpose of the human face was to remain as motionless as a tombstone. They possessed a stiff upper lip that was so rigid it could have been used to plane a piece of oak. Their humor, if one could call it that, consisted largely of puns that were older than the Magna Carta, and stories about vicars who had accidentally misplaced their trousers in a gale. It was a dignified, predictable, and thoroughly exhausting form of comedy that suggested that while God may have a sense of humor, he certainly wouldn't permit it during tea time. But on October 5th, 1969, at the ungodly hour of nearly midnight, the British Broadcasting Corporation, an institution with the structural flexibility of a frozen turnip, allowed a group of 6 overeducated lunatics to commandeer the airwaves. They called their program Monty Python's Flying Circus, a title that suggests a traveling troupe of acrobats and trained bears, but which was actually a sustained, multi-layered assault on the very concept of human logic. The architecture of the absurd. The cast consisted of 5 Englishmen from Oxford and Cambridge and 1 American, Terry Gilliam, who was responsible for the animations that looked like Victorian postcards having a violent nervous breakdown. The Englishmen were John Cleese, a man so tall and angular he appeared to be made of yardsticks; Michael Palin, who possessed the face of a friendly spaniel and the soul of a shapeshifter; Eric Idle, a master of the double entendre and the catchy tune; Terry Jones, who had a particular gift for playing shrieking elderly women; and Graham Chapman, a qualified physician who decided that the best use of a medical degree was to play a stuttering military officer who occasionally stopped sketches for being too silly. Now, the Python method of comedy was a radical departure from everything that had come before. In my day, a joke had a beginning, a middle, and a punchline. You walked a man into a bar, you gave him a predicament, and you delivered a clever remark at the end so the audience knew it was time to slap their knees and go home. The Pythons decided that punchlines were a nuisance. They viewed the traditional ending of a sketch as a form of creative bankruptcy. Instead, when a scene reached its peak of absurdity, they would simply stop. A giant foot would drop from the sky and squash the performers, or a man in a suit would walk onto the set and say, "And now for something completely different." It was a magnificent piece of honesty. It admitted that the world is not a series of tidy jokes, but a chaotic jumble of non sequiturs, where a discussion about a dead parrot can seamlessly transition into a song about a lumberjack who enjoys wearing women's clothing. The Dead Parrot and the Art of Denying Reality. The most famous of their early efforts, and a masterpiece of the English language, is the Dead Parrot sketch. A customer, Cleese, returns a Norwegian blue parrot to a pet shop because the bird is quite obviously deceased. The shopkeeper, Palin, insists the bird is merely pining for the fjords. I have spent a great deal of time observing the way people use language to avoid the truth, but I have never seen it expressed more perfectly. The customer lists every possible synonym for death. The bird has shuffled off this mortal coil. It is an ex-parrot. It has ceased to be. And yet the shopkeeper persists in his delusion. It is a perfect metaphor for the British government of 1969. The empire was dead, the pound was shrinking, and the social fabric was unraveling. But the men in the bowler hats were still standing behind the counter, insisting that everything was just pining for the fjords. It was a comedy of exhaustion, the humor of a people who had realized that if you can't fix the world, you might as well point out how ridiculous its excuses are. The Ministry of Silly Walks. Then there was the Ministry of Silly Walks. John Cleese, with his endlessly long legs, would perform a series of contortions while walking to his office, a high-ranking government position dedicated to the funding and development of silly walks. This is the ultimate jab at the bureaucracy. I have seen the machinery of government at work in Washington, London, and San Francisco, and I can tell you that the primary occupation of any department is the justification of its own existence. The Pythons merely took this to its logical conclusion. If you can have a Ministry of Defense or Ministry of Agriculture, why not a Ministry of Silly Walks? It is no more absurd than many of the things I have seen men in suits do with a straight face and a taxpayer-funded budget. The brilliance of the sketch lies in Cleese's absolute solemnity. He isn't laughing, he is a professional. He discusses the grant for the development of the walk with the gravity of a man discussing a peace treaty. It reminds us that the greatest fools are not those who act foolishly, but those who act foolishly while believing they are being profoundly serious. The American Contribution, the Animated Foot. We must not overlook Terry Gilliam's animations. Using cutouts from old magazines and classical paintings, he created a world where statues would suddenly lose their heads, where giant hedgehogs would terrorize the suburbs, and where a foot, the Cupid's foot from a Bronzino painting, would periodically descend to flatten anything that became too pompous. These animations were the glue that held the show together. They suggested that the entire universe was a collage, a collection of bits and pieces that didn't quite fit. It was a visual representation of the 1969 psyche, a world where the old Victorian certainties were being cut up and rearranged into something strange, colorful, and frequently disturbing. The legacy of the flying circus. Monty Python's Flying Circus was not merely a television show, it was a liberation movement for the imagination. It told the world that you didn't have to be sensible. It told us that authority was a joke, that tradition was often just an excuse for boredom, and that a man could be a world-renowned intellectual and still find humor in the sound of a wet fish hitting a drum. I find it delightful that while the Americans were obsessing over peace and love, and the Russians were obsessing over steel and tractors, the British were obsessing over spam. There is a sketch which gave the modern world its word for unwanted electronic messages, where a group of Vikings sings a song about canned meat in a cafe where every dish contains spam. It is a song of glorious, meaningless repetition. By the end of 1969, Monty Python had become a cult phenomenon. They had tapped into a new kind of intelligence, a humor that required the viewer to be as well-read as the performers, only to use that knowledge to appreciate a joke about a man with a tape recorder up his nose. They proved that the most effective way to dismantle a stiff upper lip is to make it tremble with laughter. I've always said that humanity has unquestionably one really effective weapon: laughter. The Pythons took that weapon, polished it, and fired it at everything in sight. They didn't care about good taste or social standards. They cared about the pure, unadulterated joy of the absurd. And in a year as heavy as 1969, that was more than a comedy. It was a public service. TwAIn's bedtime admonition. If you ever find yourself in a pet shop with a bird that won't speak, do not argue with the shopkeeper. Simply tip your hat, do a silly walk out the door, and be grateful that you aren't a Viking with a passion for canned ham. Now, close your eyes and prepare for something completely different. It's called sleep. It has no punchline, but the scenery is usually quite interesting. Just watch out for the giant foot. Chapter 16. Golda Meir takes the helm. I have spent a considerable portion of my existence, both in the flesh and in this current, rather drafty state of spirit, observing the various ways in which the human race selects its leaders. It is a process that rarely involves logic. Usually, we choose men who possess a certain majestic volume of hair, or those who can shout about the destiny of the nation until their veins stand out like cords of wood, or perhaps those who look particularly impressive while sitting on a horse. In my day, a leader was a gentleman with a gold watch and a formidable set of whiskers. In the year 1969, as we have seen, the Americans chose a man who looked like he was constantly expecting a process server. Chapter 2. But in March of that year, the nation of Israel, a small sun-drenched patch of geography that has seen more history per square inch than the rest of the world has seen per continent, decided to perform an act of political radicalism that left the world statesmen scratching their heads. They chose a grandmother. They chose Golda Meir, the Milwaukee Miracle. Now, you must understand the peculiar trajectory of this woman's life to appreciate the irony of her elevation to power. Golda was not born into a desert dynasty. She was born in Kiev, which is a place where the primary local industry was surviving the winter, and then she moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I have a great deal of affection for the American Midwest. It is a land of sturdy people, honest beer, and a climate that suggests God had a surplus of wind and snow and nowhere else to put it. Milwaukee produces a certain kind of character, a person who understands that if the pipes are frozen, you don't write a poem about it. You get a wrench. Golda was a Milwaukee school teacher. She was a woman who knew how to handle a room full of unruly children, how to stretch a budget until it squeaked, and how to look a person in the eye and tell them they were being a fool without using a single vulgarity. It turns out that these are the exact qualifications required to run a country in the Middle East, though it took the rest of the world several decades to catch on. The wardrobe of power. In 1969, the style of leadership was becoming increasingly flashy. We had the Kennedys with their touch football and their silk ties. We had the French with their de Gaulle, who was essentially a very tall monument that occasionally spoke. And then there was Golda. Golda Meir's official uniform consisted of a sensible suit that looked like it had been chosen for its durability rather than its charm, a handbag that was likely filled with state secrets and hard candies, and most famously, her orthopedic shoes. I have always maintained that you can tell everything you need to know about a person by their footwear. A man in polished boots is looking for a parade. A man in silk slippers is looking for a lounge. But a woman in orthopedic shoes is looking for a long, hard walk through the mud of reality. Golda did not march into power. She walked in with a heavy, purposeful tread that suggested she wasn't leaving until the dishes were done and the borders were secure. She was the original Iron Lady, a decade before Margaret Thatcher had even figured out how to use hairspray. But whereas Thatcher was a polished blade, Golda was a cast-iron skillet. She was warm, she was domestic, and if you hit her against something hard, it was the something hard that was going to break. The kitchen cabinet. Golda's style of governance gave birth to a term that I find particularly delightful: the kitchen cabinet. Most leaders prefer to conduct the business of state in mahogany-lined rooms filled with portraits of dead men and the smell of expensive tobacco. Golda, however, preferred her kitchen. She would invite her ministers, men who were generals, scholars, and battle-hardened veterans, to sit at her table while she served them coffee and cake. Imagine, if you will, the scene. A group of men who have spent their lives studying tanks and trajectories, sitting in a small kitchen while a grandmotherly figure in an apron tells them why their latest plan for a preemptive strike is a bit much, and asks if they've had enough sugar in their coffee. It was a masterpiece of psychological management. It is very difficult to act like a pompous conqueror when the person you are talking to is currently offering you a second piece of strudel and reminding you to wipe your feet. She treated the entire nation of Israel like a large, noisy, and perpetually endangered family. When the War of Attrition was grinding on along the Suez Canal in 1969, she didn't talk about geopolitical spheres of influence. She talked about my boys in the bunkers. She possessed a maternal ferocity that was far more terrifying than the posturing of any dictator. A dictator wants power for his ego. A grandmother wants security for her grandchildren. And there is no force in nature more persistent than a woman who thinks her family is being threatened. The grandmother of the desert. Golda was also possessed of a dry, biting wit that would have made her a formidable opponent on a Mississippi steamboat. She had no patience for the double talk of diplomacy. When people suggested that the Arabs and the Israelis should simply sit down and find a middle ground, she pointed out that the middle ground usually involved Israel being in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. She famously said, "We can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. We cannot forgive them for forcing us to kill their children. We will only have peace with the Arabs when they love their children more than they hate us." It is a statement of such devastating simplicity and profound sadness that it cuts through all the peace plans ever written on parchment. It is the wisdom of the nursery applied to the tragedy of the world. She was also remarkably acerbic about the role of women in society. When there was a spate of attacks on women at night, one minister suggested a curfew for women. Golda looked at him and said, "But it's the men who are attacking the women. If there's to be a curfew, let the men stay home." The logic is unassailable, yet it was treated as a revolutionary thought. It is the peculiar tragedy of the male of the species that we have to be told the obvious by a woman in orthopedic shoes before we can see it for ourselves. The 1969 contrast. I find it a supreme comedy that in the same year that the youth of America were at Woodstock, Chapter 5, looking for themselves through the medium of mud and music, Golda Meir was at her kitchen table looking for the survival of a people through the medium of coffee and cold-eyed resolve. The flower children were talking about a world without borders, while Golda was standing on a border with a pair of binoculars and a very long memory. One group was dreaming of a future that would never arrive. The other was managing a present that refused to go away. Golda Meir was the adult in a world that was increasingly behaving like a teenager. She didn't care about the age of Aquarius. She didn't care about the Beatles on the roof or the latest X-rated movie. She cared about the price of milk and the range of a Soviet-made missile. She was the reality check for 1969, a reminder that while we were reaching for the moon, we still had to live on the earth, and the earth was a place where people were still arguing over the same few acres of sand they'd been fighting over since the days of Abraham. The legacy of the Iron Grandmother. Golda Meir served as prime minister until 1974. She wasn't perfect. No leader is, unless they are currently being sculpted in marble. And she faced criticisms that would have buckled a lesser person. But she proved that a woman from Milwaukee could move to the desert and hold her own against the most formidable men of her time without ever losing her identity as a school teacher who expected everyone to behave themselves. She was a man among men, as David Ben-Gurion famously called her, though I suspect Golda would have found that a bit insulting to women. She was simply a human being who understood that power is not about the crown. It's about the responsibility. As we close this chapter on the year 1969, let us remember the image of Golda in her kitchen, the steam rising from the kettle, the orthopedic shoes planted firmly on the linoleum, and the fate of a nation resting in the hands of a woman who knew exactly how much sugar it took to make a hard truth go down. TwAIn's bedtime observation. If you ever find yourself in charge of a country, remember the kitchen cabinet rule. You can get a man to agree to almost anything if you give him a fresh piece of cake and remind him that his mother is watching. Now, close your eyes and dream of a world where grandmothers are in charge of everything. It would be a much quieter world, and we would all have much cleaner ears. Sleep well, the kettle is off, and the borders are secure for the night. Chapter 17. The First Artificial Heart. I have always been of the opinion that the human body is a masterpiece of divine engineering, though one that was clearly constructed by a committee that didn't expect the user to keep the thing running for more than 40 or 50 years. We are a collection of fragile pulleys, temperamental plumbing, and a central processing unit that has a distressing tendency to fixate on where it left its spectacles rather than the mysteries of the universe. But of all the components in this biological jalopy, the heart is the most celebrated. Poets have written sonnets to it, lovers have offered it as a sacrificial gift, and politicians have spent centuries pretending they actually possess one. For most of human history, if your heart decided to shuttle off this mortal coil, you generally went with it. It was considered the seat of the soul, the engine of life, and a strictly no-user serviceable part. But by April of 1969, humanity had become so emboldened by its successes in firing metal tubes at the moon, Chapter 1, that we decided the Creator's original design for the circulatory system was merely a first draft that could be improved upon with a bit of plastic, some Dacron, and a very large electricity bill. The Texas-sized egos of Houston. The setting for this particular piece of scientific hubris was Houston, Texas, a city that in 1969 was essentially a giant, humid laboratory dedicated to proving that anything God can do, a Texan can do louder and with more air conditioning. At the center of the drama were two gentlemen who possessed a level of professional rivalry that made the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys look like a mild disagreement over a croquet match. I am speaking of Dr. Michael DeBakey and Dr. Denton Cooley. These were the titans of the Texas Heart Institute, men who handled human organs with the casual confidence of a card shark handling a deck of Hoyles. DeBakey was the elder statesman, a man of meticulous detail, who had been working for years on a mechanical heart funded by the government. Cooley was the younger, more dashing protégé, a man who moved with a surgical velocity that suggested he was perpetually late for a very important lunch. They were the best of friends until they became the worst of enemies, a transition that occurred the moment they realized there was only room for one king of hearts in the state of Texas. The Liotta contrivance. Enter Dr. Domingo Liotta, an Argentinian inventor who had been working in DeBakey's lab on a mechanical pump. He had created a device that looked less like a sacred organ and more like a piece of experimental plumbing you might find under the sink of a very wealthy Martian. It was a dual-chambered pump made of plastic and fabric, designed to be powered by an external console the size of a washing machine. Now, I have seen many modern conveniences in my time, the typewriter, the telephone, the Otis elevator, but the idea of a washing machine of life is a bridge too far for a sensible man. The concept was that you would cut out the patient's actual God-given heart and replace it with this rhythmic thumper, which would then be tethered to a wall outlet by a series of tubes. It meant that while you might technically be alive, your radius of activity was strictly limited by the length of your power cord. In March of 1969, while DeBakey was away in Washington, D.C., likely telling the government how much more money he needed to play God, Dr. Cooley and Dr. Leota decided they had waited long enough. They had a patient, a gentleman named Haskell Karp, whose own heart was currently performing with the enthusiasm of a wet firecracker. The Great Plastic Swap. On April 4th, 1969, in a move that set the medical world into a state of collective apoplexy, Dent and Cooley performed the world's first artificial heart transplant. Imagine the scene. The surgeons gathered around the table, the lights glaring down like the eyes of a judgmental deity, and the Leota Cooley heart waiting in its sterile tray. They removed Mr. Karp's heart, a bold move considering that once you've taken the original out, you are somewhat committed to the replacement, and stitched in the plastic thumper. They turned on the console. The machine began to hum. The bellows began to expand and contract with a rhythmic, mechanical thwack hiss, thwack hiss. And, to the astonishment of everyone, and perhaps the disappointment of the local undertakers, it worked. Haskell Karp's blood began to move, propelled not by the mysterious spark of life, but by a pneumatic pump and a very steady supply of Texas electricity. The bridge and the fallout. The artificial heart was never intended to be a permanent fixture. It was what doctors call a bridge to transplant, a way to keep a man simmering until a real human heart could be found. For 64 hours, Mr. Karp was the most mechanical human being on the planet. He was a pioneer of the cyborg age, a man who was kept in this world by rhythmic clicking that sounded like a very persistent grandfather clock. But while the machine was humming in Houston, a different kind of storm was brewing in Washington. When Dr. DeBakey found out that his protege had borrowed his lab's research and performed the surgery without his permission, the resulting explosion was visible from the moon. The medical community was divided. Some called Cooley a hero, a man of action who had saved a life. Others called him a surgical pirate who had violated every ethic in the book. The American College of Surgeons launched an investigation. DeBakey and Cooley stopped speaking to each other for the next 38 years. It is a testament to the human ego that a man can invent a machine to replace a heart, but he cannot find a way to fix a broken friendship. The reality of the mechanical soul. I find it profoundly ironic that in the year 1969, we were so obsessed with humanity at Woodstock and progress on the moon, yet we were also working very hard to turn ourselves into appliances. The artificial heart was the ultimate expression of the mechanical age. It suggested that we are just a collection of parts, and that the soul is merely a byproduct of sufficient blood pressure. It was a telling comment on our own vanity. We are so afraid of the great beyond that we would rather be a man plugged into a wall than a man resting in peace. Furthermore, the timing of the surgery was a masterpiece of political commentary. As I noted in the table of contents, Washington, D.C. had been practicing heartless behavior for decades. The Capitol is full of men who operate on a strictly mechanical basis, calculating their movements based on the flow of power and the rhythm of the next election. To them, an artificial heart was not a medical miracle. It was a career goal. Mr. Karp eventually received a human heart transplant, but sadly, he passed away shortly thereafter. The experiment proved that while we could build a pump that worked, we couldn't yet build a body that wouldn't eventually realize it had been cheated. The bridge had reached the other side, but the ground was still soft. The legacy of the thumper. The 1969 artificial heart was a clunky, loud, and temperamental ancestor to the sleek devices of today. It was the Model T of the chest cavity. It proved that the heart is, at its most basic level, just a pump. But it also proved that a pump is not a person. We have spent the years since trying to make these machines smaller, quieter, and more reliable. We want to be able to go for a walk in the park without towing a trailer full of batteries. We want the life without the hardware. But as I look down from my current vantage point, I see that we are still the same old fools. We spend billions to keep the pump going, but we often forget to do anything worthwhile with the blood it's moving. I've always said that the heart of a fool is in his mouth, but the mouth of a wise man is in his heart. In 1969, we put the heart in a plastic box, and the world hasn't quite sounded the same since. It's a bit more rhythmic, a bit more mechanical, and a great deal more expensive. TwAIn's bedtime observation: if you ever feel your own heart skip a beat, do not immediately reach for the Sears Roebuck catalog to find a replacement. A biological heart may be temperamental, but at least it doesn't require a software update or a three-prong outlet. Now close your eyes and listen to your own internal drummer. It's a quiet, steady sound that has been perfected over millions of years. Don't worry about the plumbing. It'll last through the night if you don't give it too much to worry about. Sleep deep, the machines are taking the night shift. Chapter 18. Joe Namath's Big Mouth. There is a peculiar type of human who believes that the air inside his lungs is a form of legal tender. A man who thinks that if he speaks a thing with enough volume and a sufficient lack of doubt, the universe will feel compelled to rearrange itself just to save him the embarrassment of being wrong. Most of us, being sensible creatures with a healthy fear of the local constable and the judgment of our neighbors, tend to keep our predictions modest. We say things like, "It might rain," or "I suspect the government is lying to us," because these are safe bets that require no courage and offer no risk. But in January of 1969, the sporting world was introduced to a young man from Pennsylvania who possessed a mouth that was several sizes too large for his station in life, and a set of knees that were held together by little more than hope and high-quality athletic tape. His name was Joe Namath, though the world came to know him as Broadway Joe, a title that suggests a man who spends his evenings singing show tunes rather than being hunted by 300-pound defensive linemen who viewed his person as a convenient place to park their frustration. The aristocracy of the gridiron. To understand the sheer unadulterated audacity of Joe Namath, you must first understand the social hierarchy of professional football in 1969. On one side, you had the NFL, the National Football League, an institution that viewed itself as the landed gentry of the sport. The NFL was the establishment. Its players were stern, crew-cut individuals who looked like they had been chiseled out of granite and fed exclusively on a diet of raw steak and duty. Their teams, like the Baltimore Colts, were considered invincible, a mechanical force of nature that functioned with the cold, humorless efficiency of a tax collector's office. On the other side, you had the AFL, the American Football League. The NFL viewed the AFL with the same aristocratic disdain a diamond merchant might view a man selling genuine gold watches out of the back of a wagon. The AFL was considered a junior circuit, a collection of cast-offs, dreamers, and people who weren't quite respectable enough for the senior league. By the time Super Bowl III rolled around, the NFL teams had won the first two contests with such ease that the public began to wonder if the game was even worth playing, or if we should just mail the trophy to the Colts and go back to our Sunday afternoon naps. The Baltimore Colts were favored to win by 18 points. In the world of gambling, an 18-point spread is not a prediction. It is an obituary. It means the other team shouldn't even bother putting on their uniforms. They should just send a polite note of surrender and stay in the locker room to count their remaining teeth. Enter the dandy in white shoes. And then there was Joe. If the NFL was a Victorian parlor, Joe Namath was a loud, brassy saloon in the middle of a gold rush. He did not look like an athlete of the era. He wore his hair long. He frequented nightclubs with names that suggested a high probability of poor decisions. And, most offensively to the old guard, he wore white shoes. Now, I have lived long enough to know that white shoes are intended for three types of people: nurses, brides, and people who have entirely given up on the idea of ever walking through a patch of mud. For a football player to wear white shoes in 1969 was a form of heresy. It was a visual shout of, "Look at me," in a sport that demanded you shut up and hit someone. Namath was a playboy, a man who seemed to view the grueling violence of the football field as merely a brief interruption between his social engagements. He appeared in advertisements for pantyhose. He lived in a penthouse that looked like a movie set, and he spoke with a drawl that suggested he was always about 3 seconds away from ordering another round of drinks for the house. The guarantee at the Touchdown Club. A few days before the big game, Namath was at the Miami Touchdown Club, an establishment where men in loud shirts gathered to discuss the merits of various athletes while consuming their weight in shrimp cocktail. Someone in the crowd, likely a man who had invested heavily in the Baltimore Colts and felt a sudden need to assert his superiority, began to heckle Joe. Most men, when faced with an 18-point underdog status, would have responded with a humble, "We'll do our best," or perhaps a quiet prayer for a sudden blizzard. But Joe Namath, likely fueled by the Miami sun and a staggering surplus of self-confidence, pointed a finger at the crowd and uttered the words that would change the sport forever. "We're going to win the game. I guarantee it." The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop, provided the pin was made of solid gold and dropped onto a velvet cushion. To guarantee a victory against the Baltimore Colts was considered a form of clinical insanity. It was as if a man standing in front of a firing squad had guaranteed that the bullets would simply decide to turn around and go home once they saw his suit. The newspapers had a field day. The Baltimore players were insulted. They were incensed. They were ready to turn Joe Namath into a very expensive rug. The establishment shook its collective head and waited for the inevitable slaughter. The comedy of the invincible. On January 12, 1969, at the Orange Bowl in Miami, the slaughter didn't happen. Instead, the world witnessed a comedy of errors performed by the perfect Baltimore Colts. They fumbled the ball. They threw interceptions. They missed field goals with the regularity of a man trying to hit a barn door with a wet noodle. Meanwhile, the New York Jets, led by the man in the white shoes, moved the ball with a methodical, almost boring precision. Namath didn't throw a single touchdown pass. He didn't need to. He just sat back and operated his offense with the calm of a riverboat captain who knows exactly where the snags are hidden. He picked the Colts apart, one pass at a time, while his defense treated the Baltimore quarterbacks like they were unwanted solicitors at a private dinner party. As the clock ticked down and the score remained 16-7 in favor of the Jets, the realization began to sink in. The Junior League had won. The Playboy had delivered. The guarantee was paid in full. The image of Namath jogging off the field, one finger raised to the sky, became the defining photograph of the decade. It wasn't just a win for a football team, it was a win for the individual against the institution. It was a win for the man who refuses to be humble when he knows he is right. It was a win for the new world of the 60s over the old world of the 50s. The birth of the celebrity monster. The aftermath of Super Bowl III changed the landscape of American culture in a way that I find deeply amusing. Before Namath, an athlete was a hero, a distant, stoic figure who spoke in cliches and went back to his farm in the off-season. After Namath, the athlete became a celebrity. We realized that we didn't just want to see men play a game. We wanted to know what they were wearing, where they were eating, and who they were dating. We wanted the swagger. Namath proved that big mouth behavior is only a vice if you lose. If you win, it's called marketing. The AFL and the NFL eventually merged, forming the behemoth you see today, but the soul of the game was forever altered. We traded the crew cut for the fur coat and the aw shucks for the I told you so. I find it particularly amusing that Joe Namath's guarantee is still talked about as if it were a divine prophecy. In reality, it was just a man who knew he had a good team and was tired of being told he didn't. But in the year 1969, a year of firsts and giant leaps, Joe's big mouth was the loudest thing on the planet. He proved that if you're going to be a fool, you should be a loud, successful one, because the world has a very short memory for your failures, but a very long one for your audacity. TwAIn's bedtime admonition. If you ever find yourself tempted to guarantee a result, make sure you have the white shoes to back it up. A man who speaks without a plan is a nuisance, but a man who speaks with a guarantee is a legend, at least until the fourth quarter. Now close your eyes and dream of your own victory. You don't have to tell the neighbors. You can just raise one finger in the morning and they'll get the point. Sleep well. The score is. Chapter 19. The Death of Eisenhower. I have always found that the American public treats a successful general with a degree of reverence usually reserved for a man who has just discovered a way to turn water into gin. There is something in the national character that finds comfort in a man who knows exactly which direction to point a cannon and who possesses a chest full of ribbons that suggest he has spent his life being very brave in places with unpronounceable names. In my day, we had Ulysses S. Grant, a man of few words and many cigars who managed to save the Union while maintaining a look of permanent quiet exhaustion. In the mid-20th century, the nation found its comfort in a gentleman from Kansas named Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man who looked like he had been carved out of a very sensible piece of granite and then taught how to play a decent round of golf. But on March 28, 1969, the Ike era officially came to a close. The general finally surrendered to the only enemy that doesn't respect a five-star rank, the passage of time. His passing marked the end of a certain kind of American certainty, the kind that wears a fedora, lives in a suburb with a white picket fence, and believes that any problem in the world can be solved with a firm handshake and a sufficient supply of heavy artillery. The I like Ike phenomenon. To understand why the death of Eisenhower was such a blow to the psyche of 1969, you have to remember what he represented. He was the grandfather of the Republic. In the 1950s, the national slogan was, "I like Ike." It was a masterpiece of political marketing because it didn't ask you to agree with his policies or understand his fiscal maneuvers. It simply asked you to like him, which is as easy as liking a warm blanket or a reliable dog. He was the man who had organized D-Day, a logistical feat so staggering that it makes the planning of a modern-day wedding look like a game of tiddlywinks. He had looked at the coastline of France, looked at the most terrifying military machine in human history, and said, "Okay, let's go." When you have done that, being the President of the United States is essentially a demotion. Handling the United States Senate is a much messier business than handling the Third Reich. At least the Nazis had the decency to wear uniforms, so you knew who was trying to stab you in the back. The architect of the traffic jam, Eisenhower's greatest legacy to the American landscape was not a treaty or a tax cut, but the interstate highway system. Having seen the efficiency of the German Autobahn, a realization that must have been quite annoying at the time, he decided that the American people needed a way to travel across the continent without being thwarted by a muddy cowpath or a stoplight in a town that consisted of one store and a depressed horse. He gave us the freedom to be bored in a motorcar from sea to shining sea. He built 40,000 miles of concrete so that a man in New York could drive to California and see exactly the same gas stations, the same diners, and the same roadside attractions for 3,000 miles. It was a magnificent achievement of engineering that allowed the American family to see the country at 70 miles per hour, which is the perfect speed for ensuring that you don't actually have to talk to anyone who lives there. I suspect that if Ike had known that his highways would eventually lead to the creation of the commute, that daily ritual where millions of people sit in a line and contemplate the futility of existence while listening to the radio, he might have stuck to dirt roads. But in 1969, the highways were still a symbol of a nation on the move, even if it didn't quite know where it was going. The profit of the military-industrial complex. However, there was a darker side to the general's wisdom. In his farewell address in 1961, Eisenhower performed a move of such staggering honesty that it left the political world breathless. He warned the nation about the military-industrial complex. Think of the irony. Here was the supreme commander of the greatest military force in history, a man whose entire career was built on the production of tanks, planes, and bullets, telling the American people, "Watch out for the fellows who build the tanks, planes, and bullets. They're getting a bit too cozy with the government, and if you aren't careful, they'll start running the place. It was as if a master chef had come out of the kitchen to warn the diners that the soup was poisoned, but that he'd be happy to serve them a second helping anyway. It was a moment of profound clarity that the nation promptly ignored for the next 60 years. By 1969, the complex was in full bloom, and the war in Vietnam was the proof that the general had been a better prophet than we deserved. The 1969 contrast, the passing of the old guard. Eisenhower died in Washington, D.C. at the age of 78. His funeral was a grand, somber affair, a final parade for the man who had seen the world through its darkest hour. But as the caisson rolled through the streets, the world outside the cemetery was a very different place than the one Ike had built. In Ike's world, hair was short, music had a melody, and protest was something you did at a PTA meeting. In 1969, hair was reaching for the shoulders. The music sounded like a factory exploding in a thunderstorm, and the youth were currently occupying the dean's office. The contrast was delicious. Here was the man who had defeated the totalitarians, being laid to rest just as the counterculture was busy questioning whether the very idea of order was a form of oppression. The 1950s, the decade of the charcoal grill and the gray flannel suit, was being lowered into the ground alongside its champion. I find it poetic that Eisenhower, a man of such immense discipline, spent his retirement years playing golf. Golf is the perfect metaphor for a retired general. It is a game of strategy, terrain, and the occasional use of force, but the only thing you are actually trying to defeat is a small white ball that hasn't done anything to harm you. He pursued the game with the same intensity he had used to plan the liberation of Europe, proving that a man's character doesn't change, only his targets. The last of the adults. As the 1960s roared toward their conclusion, the loss of Eisenhower felt like the loss of the last adult in the room. Whether you liked him or not, you knew that Ike wasn't going to lie to you about the military-industrial complex, and he wasn't going to walk on the beach in black wingtip shoes, looking at you, Mr. Nixon. He possessed a quiet dignity that had been replaced by the frantic, sweaty anxiety of the new political era. He was a man who understood that every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. He said that in 1953. In 1969, the rockets were firing, the warships were launching, and the theft was well underway. I've always said that all you need in this life is ignorance and confidence, and then success is sure. Eisenhower had plenty of confidence, but he lacked the necessary ignorance to be a truly successful modern politician. He knew too much about the cost of things. He knew what a bullet actually does, and he knew that a highway is just a way to get to a funeral faster. The final salute. Eisenhower was buried in Abilene, Kansas, in a small chapel on the grounds of his library. He returned to the soil of the Midwest, far from the mahogany rooms of power and the noise of the great society. He went back to the place where the wind blows across the wheat, and the sky is big enough to hold even a 5-star ego. His death was the end of the post-war era. The world he had helped create, a world of superpowers, suburbs, and supermarkets, was still there. But the man who had held the blueprint was gone. As 1969 continued its chaotic, muddy, and brilliant journey, the ghost of Ike remained a silent reminder that once upon a time we were led by a man who didn't need a focus group to tell him that Nazis were bad and that highways were good. TwAIn's bedtime. Consideration. If you ever find yourself in a position of power, remember to warn the people about the complex. They won't listen, but it'll make you look very wise in the history books later on. Now, close your eyes and dream of a 40,000-mile highway with no traffic and a golf course at the end of it. The general has retired for the night, and you should too. Sleep well. The world is in the hands of the kids now, and they've promised to be very groovy about it. Chapter 20. New Year's Eve. The Great Hangover begins. Man has a curious and persistent habit of celebrating the fact that he has managed to survive another trip around the sun without being struck by lightning, swallowed by a sinkhole, or bored to death by his own relatives. We treat the passing of a year as a personal victory, a triumph of the will over the sheer grinding machinery of the universe. In the final hours of December 31st, 1969, this impulse reached a fever pitch of desperation. It was not merely the end of a year. It was the end of a decade that had tried to reinvent the human soul and ended up merely complicating the human wardrobe. The 60s did not so much end as they collapsed under the weight of their own accumulated fringe, patchouli, and broken promises. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the world stood on the threshold of a new era, feeling very much like a man who had fallen down 3 flights of stairs and arrived at a formal gala, bruised, confused, and desperately in need of a very large gin and tonic. The inventory of a decade. Before the corks could be popped and the resolutions could be lied about, there was the inevitable tallying of the books. 1969 had been a year of such staggering firsts that the average mind was beginning to feel a bit frayed at the edges. We had gone to the moon, Chapter 1, and discovered that it was precisely as interesting as a gravel pit in Kansas, only with less air and a much higher travel expense. We had gathered in a muddy field in Bethel, Chapter 5, to prove that 500,000 people could live in a swamp without killing each other, provided there was enough guitar music to act as a sedative. We had watched the silent majority, Chapter 2, find its voice, which turned out to sound remarkably like a man complaining about the neighborhood's property values. We had seen the Beatles on a roof, Chapter 3, a general in his grave, Chapter 19, and a senator in a pond, Chapter 12. We had invented a way for computers to talk to each other, Chapter 6, a low that would eventually become a woe, and we had seen the first plastic heart, Chapter 17, thumping away in a chest, proving that even our most sacred organ could be replaced by something you might find in a Sears catalog. It was a staggering amount of history to digest in 12 months. If 1969 were a meal, it would have been a 12-course banquet where every dish was seasoned with gunpowder and served on a vibrating plate. By New Year's Eve, the collective digestion of the human race was in a state of revolt. The ritual of the resolution. As the hour approached, people began the ancient and hollow ritual of the New Year's resolution. I have always found the resolution to be the most charming of human delusions. It is the belief that by the simple act of changing a calendar page, a man who has spent 40 years being a scoundrel can suddenly transform into a saint, or that a woman who enjoys a second helping of pie can suddenly find spiritual fulfillment in a celery stick. In 1969, the resolutions were particularly poignant. The hippie resolved to perhaps buy a bar of soap, or at least to find a commune that had a slightly more reliable source of electricity. The politician resolved to find a new way to describe a withdrawal that sounded like a victory, a linguistic challenge that would keep the finest minds of Washington occupied for years to come. The scientist resolved to find a way to get to Mars, having realized that the moon didn't have a single decent hotel. The average citizen resolved to figure out what a transistor was and why it was currently making his son's bedroom sound like a battlefield. A resolution is a way for a man to give his conscience a vacation for the next 12 months by making a promise he has no intention of keeping for more than 12 minutes. It is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, and in 1969, the tributes were pouring in like rain. The party of the century. The parties of December 31st, 1969 were a fascinating study in cultural collision. In the grand ballrooms of the cities, the establishment gathered in their tuxedos and silk gowns, attempting to toast to a future that they secretly suspected was going to be very loud and remarkably unattractive. They drank champagne and spoke of stability, while outside their windows, the world was vibrating with the bass lines of a revolution they didn't understand. In the lofts of Greenwich Village and the crash pads of San Francisco, the youth gathered in a cloud of incense and questionable smoke. They wore beads, they wore bells, and they spoke of the age of Aquarius. They believed that the 1970s would be a decade of light and love, where the walls of the military-industrial complex would crumble before the sound of a tambourine. I find it delicious that both groups were entirely wrong. The 70s would not be a decade of stability, nor would they be a decade of light. They were going to be a decade of polyester, disco, and gas lines. The world was about to trade its idealism for a leisure suit, a transaction that remains one of the most baffling in human history. The stroke of midnight. When the clock finally struck 12, the roar that went up from the world was not a shout of joy, but a collective sigh of relief. The 60s were finally over. They had been a long, strange, and exhausting trip. We had tried everything: free love, expensive wars, celestial travel, and experimental surgery. And we were still just the same old collection of fools, only with longer hair and a slightly more cynical outlook on life. I have often said that the only way to keep your health is to eat what you don't want, drink what you don't like, and do what you'd rather not. By the end of 1969, the human race had done a great deal of what it would rather not, and its health was looking a bit precarious. The transition to 1970 was the ultimate hangover. The lights were too bright, the music was too loud, and the bill was finally coming due. We had spent the decade finding ourselves, and we were beginning to realize that we weren't entirely pleased with the person we had found. We were a species that could reach the moon but couldn't seem to figure out how to live in a muddy field without losing our shoes. The farewell to 1969. As the last echoes of Auld Lang Syne faded into the chilly January air, the ghost of Mark Twain, that's me, in case you'd forgotten, looked down and felt a twinge of sympathy. It is a hard thing to be a human. It is a constant struggle to balance the giant leap with the small step, and to try to keep your dignity while wearing a black wingtip shoe on a sandy beach. 1969 was a masterpiece of absurdity. It was a year that proved that man is a creature of infinite variety and spectacular incompetence. We are at our best when we are dreaming of the stars, and we are at our funniest when we are trying to navigate a bridge in an Oldsmobile. I've always said that the human race has one really effective weapon, and that is laughter. If you can't laugh at the fact that we spent 1969 trying to save the world with a song and a bag of moon rocks, then you haven't been paying attention. The bedtime benediction. Now, my weary traveler of history, it is time to close the book. The decade is over. The fires of Woodstock have been extinguished by the rain. The footprints on the moon are silent, and the silent majority has gone back to sleep. You have navigated 20 chapters of celestial folly and earthly absurdity. You have seen the heights of our ambition and the depths of our mud. You have met grandmothers who ran nations and outlaws who rode bicycles. You have heard the low of the computer and the boom of the Concorde. It is time for you to take your own giant leap into the land of dreams. Do not worry about the 1970s. They are filled with orange shag carpeting and things called 8-track tapes, and you really aren't missing much yet. Close your eyes. Imagine the quiet, dusty silence of the lunar surface. Imagine the gentle hum of a 747 crossing the dark Atlantic. Imagine the sound of a dead parrot pining for the fjords. Let the wit of the past fade into a comfortable, warm hum. TwAIn's final note for 1969. History is just news that has had time to grow a beard and lose its temper. 1969 was the loudest, messiest, most brilliant news we ever had. But even the loudest year eventually runs out of breath. Sleep deep, my friend. The future is coming, and I hear it has a lot of glitter and a very funky beat. But that is a story for another night. For now, just remember, no matter how high you jump, the ground is always there to catch you. And if you're lucky, there will be a gin and tonic waiting for you when you land. Good night, 1969, and good night to you. This has been Mark Twain